The saddle took 43 nights to finish. Evelyn knew the exact number because she had counted them. Not deliberately, not with any kind of discipline, but because sleep had become something that happened to other people. She would lie in the dark for an hour, maybe two, and then the stillness of the bedroom would press down on her chest like a stone, and she would rise and go to the workshop and put her hands to work because her hands, at least, still knew what to do. Daniel had built the workshop himself, 8 years ago, hammering the frame into the hard ground at the eastern edge of their property while she stood in the yard watching and handing him nails when he asked. It was a plain structure, raw timber walls, a clay-packed floor, 2 lanterns hanging from hooks, but it held the smell of leather and saddle oil and iron in a way that the house never did. And after he died, it was the only room on the Hart Ranch that didn't feel like a place where something had been taken away. She worked on the saddle every night and most mornings, and some afternoons when the ranch hands could manage without her. She tooled the leather herself, pressing the design in by hand with a swivel knife and beveling chisel, spending more time on the fender scroll than she had ever spent on anything in her life. The cantle rose at the exact angle she had been imagining for 2 years. The horn was wrapped in braided rawhide so tight it wouldn't give under any real working pressure. And the seat was cut from a single piece of skirting leather she had been saving since before the wedding, holding it back for something that deserved it. Daniel had asked her once what she was waiting for with that leather. She had told him she didn't know yet. She knew now. The morning she finished it, she sat on the stool in the workshop for a long time without moving. The saddle rested on the stand in front of her, and the early light came through the single east-facing window and lay across the cantle in a way that made the tooling look like it had been carved into the leather rather than pressed. She reached out and ran her thumb along the edge of the skirt. Even, firm, no drag. She had done this correctly. She had done this the way it deserved to be done. She thought about Daniel for a moment. Just a moment, because she had learned that longer than a moment was dangerous in the mornings when there was still a day ahead of her. And then she stood up, covered the saddle with a clean cloth, and went inside to wash her face and change her shirt. Silver Creek was the kind of town that had opinions about everything and kept them circulating like water in a mill wheel. It had one main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without trouble, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, a hotel that was better than it looked from the outside, and a general goods store that Clifton Marsh had owned for 11 years and ran with the particular brand of cheerfulness that concealed, imperfectly, a very precise awareness of his own importance. Marsh was not a large man, but he took up a great deal of room. He dressed well, spoke in a voice that carried across a crowded room without effort, and had the gift of making people feel, when he agreed with them, that they had said something intelligent, and when he disagreed, that they had embarrassed themselves. He sold dry goods, tools, saddle equipment, rope, grain, and a variety of other items the frontier demanded. And he had an arrangement with 4 or 5 ranchers in the county to purchase their leather work and resell it to buyers in Creston and the settlements further west. He had made a good deal of money from this arrangement. He liked making a good deal of money. Evelyn had dealt with Marsh twice before, both times selling him smaller pieces. A set of saddlebags, a pair of bridles, at prices she had accepted because she needed the money faster than she could afford to be stubborn. Those transactions had left her feeling vaguely as though she had agreed to something she hadn't quite understood, but she had never been able to point to anything specific that Marsh had done wrong. He had paid her. He had been pleasant enough. The feeling was probably just her own discomfort with needing the sale so badly. This time was different. This time she had something that was worth real money, and she knew it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to make the transaction easier for him. She drove the wagon into Silver Creek on a Tuesday morning, the saddle wrapped in the clean cloth in the wagon bed. She had worn her good blouse, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she felt that the saddle deserved someone who looked like they believed in what they were bringing. She tied the wagon in front of Marsh's store, lifted the saddle carefully from the bed, and carried it inside. The store was busy for a Tuesday. 3 men she recognized, 2 of them ranchers from the eastern side of the county, one a supply buyer who came through every few weeks from Creston, stood near the counter talking, and a woman she didn't know was examining bolts of fabric near the window. The smell of the store was the usual mix of sawdust and tobacco and something sweet from the candy jars on the near shelf. Marsh was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted through something too quick to read before settling into the practiced warmth he used for customers. "Mrs. Hart." He came around the counter. "Haven't seen you in a while. How are things out at the ranch?" Fine, she said. Busy. She set the saddle on the counter, not roughly but firmly, and pulled the cloth away. There was a brief silence. One of the ranchers near the back of the store took a half step forward without seeming to notice he was doing it. Even the woman at the fabric bolts glanced over. The saddle sat on this counter under the store's lamps, and it looked exactly the way it had looked in the workshop under the morning light, which was to say, exceptional. The tooling along the fender ran in a pattern of interlocking vines that managed to be elaborate without being fussy. The seat leather had the particular warm color of something that had been chosen well and treated right. The hardware was brass, polished, fitted into the leather so cleanly it looked grown there rather than set. Marsh looked at it for a moment without speaking. His expression was careful in a way that told her he had already formed an assessment and was deciding how to use it. "Nice work," he said finally. His voice was pleasant. "You've always had a good hand with leather." "Thank you," she said. "I'm asking $65 for it." The silence that followed was different from the first one. This one had weight to it. "65," Marsh repeated. Not a question. More like he was tasting the number. "That's fair for this quality. You'd sell it in Creston for 110, maybe more. I know what the market's running." "You know what the market was running," Marsh said with a slight smile. "About 2 years ago. Things have shifted." "I've had 3 letters from buyers in Creston in the past 6 months," Evelyn said. "I know what's shifted." He looked at the saddle again. She watched him look at it, and she could see in his face, in the small, deliberate flatness of it, that he knew exactly what it was worth and was calculating something else entirely. "I can do 35, he said. She had expected a low opening number. She had prepared herself for it, told herself on the ride into town that she would not react, that she would stay level and negotiate from a position of calm. But 35, for something she had spent 43 nights making, for something she had put the last of Daniel's saved skirting leather into, was not a low opening number. It was something else. $35, she said. "It's a fair offer for a widow's work," Marsh said. He was still pleasant. "You've been through a hard time, and I understand that, but I have to account for the market I'm actually selling into, not the one you're imagining. A widow's work." She heard it the way you hear a sound you weren't expecting, a sharp edge where you thought there was none. "My husband taught me this craft," she said carefully, "and I've been practicing it for 12 years. What you're looking at didn't come from grief. It came from 12 years of work." "Of course," Marsh said. "Of course it did. But I'm also looking at a piece with some, let's say, idiosyncratic design choices that may not appeal to every buyer. The cantle angle is unusual. Not everyone wants unusual." "The cantle angle is correct," she said. "Correct is a matter of opinion in saddle work, Mrs. Hart, and buyers in Creston have opinions." He smiled, and the smile was kind in the way that knives are sometimes described as kind when they're very sharp. "I'm also going to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty. There's a certain kind of buyer who hesitates to spend real money on a woman's saddle. It's not fair, it's not right, but it's real, and it affects what I can reasonably offer." The 2 ranchers near the back of the store were not pretending to look elsewhere anymore. They were watching with the particular attentiveness of men who expected to have something to talk about later. "I'm also going to be honest with you," Evelyn said. "If you say 35 again, I'm going to pick this saddle up and walk out that door." Marsh tilted his head. "Now, Mrs. Hart, let's not be hasty. I know things are difficult at the ranch right now. I know Daniel left things in a certain—" "Don't talk about what Daniel left," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which she thought was probably more effective. "You didn't know Daniel. You bought 2 pieces of leatherwork from him, and you paid him less than they were worth both times, and he was too polite to argue with you about it. I'm not Daniel." Something shifted in Marsh's expression. Not much. He was too practiced for much, but enough. The pleasant warmth cooled by a degree. "You're right that you're not Daniel," he said. "Daniel was a reasonable man." "Daniel was a man who needed the sale," she said. "I need the sale too, but not badly enough to take $35 for $65 of work." "Then perhaps you should find another buyer." "Perhaps I should." She reached out and picked up the saddle. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe she was just tired, but she didn't let it show. She folded the cloth back over it deliberately, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the door. "I hope you reconsider," Marsh said to her back. His voice had recovered its pleasantness, but there was something else in it now, something thin and certain. "The next buyer you find will offer you less. You know that, don't you? A widow alone on 40 acres, trying to sell saddles she made by herself in the middle of the night. She stopped walking. She didn't turn around. She stood very still for a moment, facing the door, with the saddle under her arm and the whole store watching, and she felt something inside her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some compound of both that she did not yet have a name for. Then she walked out. The sunlight outside was flat and bright, the kind that made you squint after the dimness of the store. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, the saddle still under her arm, and took a slow breath. She was not going to cry on the main street of Silver Creek. That was not something she was going to do. She had not cried in public since the funeral, and she was not going to start now over Clifton Marsh. She was trying to decide whether to go to the wagon or to stand here for another moment when she heard footsteps behind her. The particular sound of someone coming out of the store with purpose, and she straightened and prepared herself to turn around and deal with whatever Marsh had sent after her. "Ma'am?" It wasn't Marsh's voice. It was deeper and quieter, with an accent from further north. She turned. The man who had come out after her was tall and lean, in the way of someone who had spent a long time doing physical work and hadn't gotten soft from stopping. He was probably 40, maybe a few years past it, with the particular weathered quality of someone who spent more time outside than in. He wore a clean shirt and a good coat, and he was holding his hat in both hands with a care that suggested he'd put some thought into the gesture. She didn't recognize him. Silver Creek was not a large town, but there were ranchers from the surrounding area she didn't know well. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I was in the store. I saw the saddle." She looked at him. "My name is Garrett Hale," he said. "I run the Double H south of Caprock Creek, about 14 miles from here." She knew the name. Not the man, but the name. Double H was a working operation, 2,000 acres, well regarded, one of the larger established ranches in the county. She had heard it mentioned respectfully in conversations she'd been on the edge of, the kind of operation that had been there long enough to have a reputation for doing things right. "Evelyn Hart," she said. He nodded. He already knew who she was. She could tell. "I'd like to look at the saddle again, if you don't mind, in the light out here." She set it on the edge of the wagon and unwrapped it. The direct sunlight was better than the store lamps. It showed the work more plainly. Garrett Hale crouched down to look at it at eye level, which was the correct way to look at saddle work, and she watched him do it with the attention of someone who actually knew what he was examining. He ran one finger along the edge of the skirt without touching the seat leather, which told her something. He was checking the cut before he looked at the finish. "How long did this take you?" he said. 43 days, she said. "Nights, mostly." He stood up. "I'll give you 65 for it." She looked at him steadily. "Cash." "Cash," he agreed. "Today. I have it on me." He reached into his coat. "I also want to ask about 6 more." She blinked. Not visibly, she hoped, but something in her face must have shifted because he looked at her with an expression that was careful not to be pitying. "I have 14 working hands, and 5 of them are riding on saddles that should have been replaced 2 years ago," he said. "I've been looking for someone who does work like this. I didn't know it was this close." 6 saddles, she said. "If you're willing. No rush on timing. I know it takes time to do it right, and I'd rather you take the time than hurry it." He paused. "I'll pay the same rate for the others. 65 each, unless there are specific requests that change the cost." She looked at him for a moment. The morning sun was warm on her back, and the street of Silver Creek was moving around them in the ordinary way of a Tuesday. A wagon going past, 2 women coming out of the post office across the street, a dog trotting purposefully toward the alley beside the hotel. She had come into town this morning, hoping to walk out with $65 and some kind of path forward. She had nearly walked out with nothing. "I'm willing," she said. He counted out $65 from a leather wallet. Real money, not script, not a note, and handed it to her with a straightforward directness that she appreciated more than she expected to. No ceremony, no commentary about her situation, just a transaction between people who had agreed on a fair price. "I'll come out to the ranch in the next week or 2 to talk about specifications for the others," he said, "if that's agreeable." "That's agreeable," she said. He nodded and put his hat back on. He glanced toward the store once, briefly, and then back at her. "Marsh doesn't know good work when it costs him something," he said. It wasn't said with anger, just as a plain statement, the way you might say the sky was clear. Then he walked back to his horse at the rail and rode south out of Silver Creek. She stood for a moment with the $65 in her hand and the empty saddle stand in the wagon bed, and she looked at the money and thought about 43 nights and the skirting leather she had saved since before she was married, and the way Marsh had said widow's work as though those two words together made something worth less. She put the money in her coat pocket and drove home. The ranch was quiet when she got back. Her two hands, Marcus, who was 60 and had worked for Daniel for 9 years and shown no interest in leaving after the funeral, and a younger man named Pete, who had come on in the spring and turned out to be reliable with horses, were somewhere on the south pasture doing fence work she had asked them to start 3 days ago. She could hear, faintly, the sound of hammering. She unhitched the wagon and watered the horse and walked out to the workshop, because that was where she went when she needed to think. The workshop was empty now in the way it hadn't been for 43 nights. The stand was bare, the tools were back in their proper places, the scraps of leather from the saddle's making had been cleared and tossed. She had cleaned up the night before, when the saddle was finished, because leaving a mess felt like leaving something incomplete. She sat on the stool in the middle of the empty room and looked at the bare stand. 6 saddles. At $65 each, that was $390, more money than the ranch had seen in the past 8 months. More than enough to clear the supply debts and make the spring tax payment and buy the new harness she had been deferring since February. More than enough to make it to next year. She should have felt relief, she supposed, and she did feel something in that direction. A loosening somewhere under her ribs that she recognized as the sensation of crisis being postponed. But there was something else, too, something smaller and more complicated, something she kept turning toward and away from without quite looking at directly. Daniel had been a good craftsman. He had made good saddles, solid bridles, work that lasted. He had not been what she was. She had understood that for years without making too much of it, because they had built something together, and that was not about who was better at what. It was about what got done. But Daniel had been selling to Marsh for 3 years, 2 pieces at a time, at prices she now understood had been significantly below what the work was worth. He had known. He must have known. Daniel was not a man who failed to understand the value of things. He had taken the lower price anyway, because they needed the sales, and because Marsh was the most consistent buyer within a reasonable distance, and because arguing had costs that weren't always worth paying. She understood all of that. She did not fault him for it, but she also thought, sitting in the empty workshop on the Tuesday afternoon, that she had walked into Clifton Marsh's store and walked back out again with her work under her arm and $65 in her pocket from a man who had looked at the saddle correctly and paid what it was worth. She thought that she was not going to do what Daniel had done. She was not going to take the lower price because it was easier, because arguing was costly, because the man across the counter had found a way to make her feel that her work was less than what she knew it to be. Not because she was better than Daniel. She was not making a statement about Daniel at all. Just because she couldn't. Just because she had spent 43 nights making something she believed in, and she had carried it into town, and she was simply not, going to let Clifton Marsh put $35 on it and call it fair. She sat in the workshop for a while longer and listened to the faint hammering from the south pasture and let the afternoon light move across the floor. Then she got up and went to start a list of materials she would need for the first of the 6 saddles. That evening, after dinner, she went through Daniel's papers. This was something she had been avoiding since the funeral. Not the financial records, those she had dealt with quickly from necessity, but the other papers, the ones he had kept in the bottom drawer of the desk in the front room. Personal correspondence, notes to himself, a ledger he had maintained since before they were married that she had never needed to look at because it was his, and because looking at it had felt, during the 4 months since he died, like stepping into a room where she was not supposed to be. She needed to look at it now. She needed to understand exactly where they stood. Not generally, not approximately, but precisely. If she was going to take on 6 saddles and think about what came after 6 saddles, she needed to know what she was building on. The ledger was where she expected it, under a bundle of letters from his brother in the Eastern Territories, and a deed copy she already had a copy of. She carried it to the table under the lamp and opened it. Daniel's handwriting was very neat, which she had always found slightly surprising in a man who worked with his hands, and the ledger ran in tight columns of figures going back to the year they had come to Silver Creek. She read through it for a while, following the record of money in and out. Cattle sales, supply costs, payments on the land note, the modest and consistent income from saddle work. It was the history of a life being lived carefully, frugally, with attention. She turned to the most recent entries, the last 6 months of the ledger. She read the figures once, and then again, frowning. And then she read them a third time because she was not certain she was reading them correctly. There was a debt here she did not recognize. It was large, larger than it should have been possible for them to have accumulated without her knowing about it. And it was entered in Daniel's handwriting, in the same neat columns as everything else, under a creditor name she had never heard, Vance Land and Property Trust. She sat very still under the lamp for a long moment. She had handled all of the debts after the funeral. She had gone through every record she could find and contacted every creditor and made arrangements for everything that needed arranging. She had not seen this name anywhere. She turned back through the ledger, looking for when the entry first appeared. It had been added to the ledger in what looked like the last week of Daniel's handwriting, the last few pages, where the entries became slightly less regular, slightly less certain, as though his attention had been elsewhere. The debt was there, fully formed, without any prior entries that would have shown it accumulating over time. It had simply appeared. She looked at the figure again. She looked at the creditor's name. She closed the ledger and sat with her hand on the cover for a moment, feeling the leather under her palm, and thought about what it meant that her husband, who wrote everything down, who had maintained this record since before she knew him, had not mentioned this debt to her. Not once. Not in conversation, not in a letter, not in the last weeks of his life when she had sat with him and talked about everything they needed to talk about. The workshop was dark outside the window. The ranch was quiet. Somewhere across the south pasture, a coyote was moving. She could hear the faint, distant sound of it, high and thin, carrying across the night air. She sat at the table under the lamp with her hand on Daniel's ledger, and she felt the first small, cold stirring of something that was not grief. Something that was closer to suspicion and worse than fear, because suspicion at least had a direction. She opened the ledger again and looked at the creditor's name, Vance Land and Property Trust. She had never heard of it, but she was going to find out what it was. Sleep was not something that happened that night either, but this time it was not grief keeping her awake. She lay in the dark and thought about numbers. She thought about the figure in the ledger and the creditor's name and the timeline, when the entry had appeared, how it was written, what it would mean if it was real, and what it would mean if it wasn't. She also thought about the $65 in her coat pocket, which was hanging on the hook by the bedroom door, and about Garrett Hale looking at the saddle at eye level and checking the cut of the skirt before he looked at the finish. And she thought about 6 more saddles, and what could be built from that if nothing got in the way. She needed nothing to get in the way. She got up around 2 in the morning and went back to the workshop, not to work, but because the workshop was where she could think, and she sat on the stool in the dark. She didn't bother with the lantern, and worked through what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she was going to do in the morning. In the morning, she was going to ask Marcus if Daniel had ever mentioned anyone named Vance, or a land trust, or a creditor she didn't know about. Marcus had been with Daniel longer than she had in some ways. Not more intimately, not with more knowledge of the important things, but with more hours of ordinary workday proximity, the kind that sometimes carried information the evenings at home didn't. She was also going to write to her husband's brother, who handled correspondence in the Eastern Territories and kept records with the same precision Daniel had. If there was something to know, Thomas Hart might know it. And she was going to go through the rest of Daniel's papers, all of them, every drawer, every pocket of every coat still hanging in the wardrobe, because she understood now that there might be things she had not found the first time, not because she had been careless, but because she had been grieving and looking for what she expected to find. And the thing about unexpected things was that you had to be looking for the unexpected. She sat in the dark workshop with her hands on her knees and let her eyes adjust to the moonlight coming through the east window. The ranch was 40 acres. Daniel had bought it on credit 11 years ago and paid it down steadily, carefully, the way he did everything until the note was nearly clear. 4 months ago, when he died, there had been very little left on it. She had read the land note herself. She knew what it said. If there was another debt, a real debt, a legitimate one, the ranch could be at risk. She understood that. She was not hiding from it. But she also understood that an entry in a ledger in handwriting that looked slightly different from Daniel's ordinary handwriting under the name of an organization she had never heard of was not necessarily a real debt. It might be something else. She didn't know yet what something else meant, but she was going to find out. Outside, the coyote called again, further away now, fading south toward the flat country beyond the creek. She listened until she couldn't hear it anymore, and then she sat in the quiet of the workshop and thought about 43 nights and $65 and the name Vance Land and Property Trust. And she waited for morning to come. It came slowly, the way mornings did in late autumn. Gray first and then pale, and then, finally, the particular quality of early light that meant the day had actually begun. She watched it happen through the east window without moving until the lanterns were unnecessary, and then she stood up and stretched the stiffness from her back and went to start coffee. Marcus was already at the small table in the kitchen when she came in, which was usual. He had the habit of being early, and the manners not to say anything about it. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She got the coffee going and stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment, thinking about how to start. Marcus was a private man, and she was a private woman, and they had managed 9 years of proximity at the ranch, partly by respecting each other's privacy, which meant asking direct questions sometimes required something to counterbalance the directness. She turned around. "I need to ask you something." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "All right. Did Daniel ever mention someone named Vance to you, or a land trust, or any creditor besides the ones I settled after he died?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He set his cup down. She watched him think, and what she watched was not the thinking of a man trying to remember something. It was the thinking of a man deciding something. "Marcus," she said. "He mentioned a name," Marcus said slowly. "About 2 months before he died. We were mending fence on the north side, and He paused. He was quieter than usual. And at one point he said a name, not to me directly, more like he was saying it to himself. "What name?" "Vance," Marcus said. "Just the one word?" I asked him what it was, and he said never mind, and we went back to work. I let it go because he didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't push. He looked at her steadily. "I should have mentioned it before. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure it was anything." "You couldn't have known," she said. She poured her coffee and thought about Daniel 2 months before he died, standing at the fence line and saying a name he wasn't saying to anyone. She thought about what that meant. "It might be nothing," she said, mostly to herself. Marcus looked at her in a way that told her he didn't think it was nothing and wasn't going to insult her by saying so. "I'm going to look through the rest of his papers today," she said. He nodded. "If it's something," she said, "I'll deal with it." He nodded again and drank his coffee, and she drank hers, and outside the window the sun was finally clear of the horizon, and the day was beginning in earnest. She did not yet know what the day was going to require of her, but she had walked into Clifton Marsh's store yesterday with a saddle worth $65, and she had walked back out again with $65, and she thought that was probably a reasonable indication of what she was prepared to do when the situation required it. She put her coffee cup down and went to go through Daniel's papers. Daniel's papers were in 4 places. She found the first pile where she expected it, the bottom drawer of the desk, under the letters from his brother and the deed copy she already knew about. The second was in a cedar box on the wardrobe shelf, which held older correspondence and some records from the years before Silver Creek that she had never felt the need to examine. The third was a leather satchel hanging from a hook inside the wardrobe door itself, flattened enough that she had mistaken it for a spare belt every time she had opened that door in 4 months of mornings. The fourth was in the workshop, tucked into the cavity behind the second shelf of the tool rack, wrapped in oilcloth. She found that last one by accident, 2 hours into the search, when she was moving tools to reach a box she thought she'd seen pushed to the back. Her hand touched the oilcloth and she stopped and stood there for a moment before she pulled it out. Daniel had not hidden things from her. That was not who he was. He had been, to a degree she had sometimes found mildly frustrating, an open man, not effusive, not given to sharing feeling at length, but transparent in the way his life was arranged. She had always known where his money was, what he was thinking about, what worried him. She unwrapped the oilcloth at the workbench. Inside was a journal. Not the ledger she had found the night before. Something else, smaller, with a plain brown cover worn soft at the corners from handling. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Daniel's, but compressed and quick in a way she rarely saw from him. He wrote this way when he was moving fast, when the thought was outrunning the pen. She had seen it in grocery lists and in the margins of almanacs. She had not seen it in anything that looked like a journal. She read, She was still in the workshop 2 hours later when Pete knocked on the doorframe and asked if she wanted him to move the wagon to the south barn. "Yes," she said, without looking up from the journal. "Thank you." He lingered for a moment, sensing something, then left. She turned another page. Daniel had been keeping this journal for 14 months. It started simply enough. Observations about the land, notes about a conversation with a man named Aldous Webb he had met at the county assessor's office in Creston, a reference to a widow named Clara Foss who had apparently lost her ranch north of Caprock Creek under circumstances that struck Daniel as unusual. He had written about Clara Foss with the careful neutrality of a man who was noting something down in case it turned out to be important, not yet certain it was. Over the following months, the journal changed. The entries became longer, more detailed, more urgent, in a way that had nothing to do with the handwriting. The handwriting stayed quick throughout, but came through in the content itself, in the way Daniel began connecting things. Clara Foss and her forged debt. A woman named Ruth Ingram, whose ranch southeast of Silver Creek had been claimed by a creditor she couldn't identify and lost before she found a lawyer willing to take the case. A third widow, Dorothea Crane, who had sold her property to a land buyer within 3 weeks of her husband's death for a price her neighbors had described, afterward, as deeply below what the land was worth, though Dorothea had not wanted to say so publicly. In each case, the creditor or buyer had some connection to the same name, Vance. Not always directly. Sometimes it was a subsidiary. Sometimes it was a lawyer acting on behalf of an unnamed client. Sometimes it was a land trust with a different title that Daniel had traced, through a chain of recorded transactions at the assessor's office, back to the same principle. He had done this carefully, methodically, in a way that told her he had spent real time on it, trips to Creston, letters to county offices, conversations with people who might know something and might be willing to say it. He had never told her any of this. She sat with that for a moment, in the middle of reading, and let herself feel it without pulling away from it. He had not told her. He had been doing this for 14 months, this careful private investigation into something that frightened him enough to hide the record of it behind the tool shelf, and he had not told her. She understood why, probably, or she could construct a version of why that was plausible and kind. He had not wanted to worry her. He had not been certain enough of what he was finding. He had wanted to be sure before he brought it to her, because bringing something like this to her would mean something would have to be done about it, and he had not yet figured out what. She kept reading. The last third of the journal was different from the first 2/3. The entries were shorter and less structured, and there were gaps between them, days, sometimes more than a week. The careful connective work of the early pages gave way to something more fragmented, notes rather than narrative. In October, 2 months before he died, Daniel had written, "Webb knows I've been asking. I saw his man outside the assessor's office in Creston Tuesday. Didn't approach, didn't need to. The point was for me to see him." She read that 3 times. Webb knows I've been asking. Aldous Webb. The name had appeared on the first page of the journal at the assessor's office in Creston. She turned back and found it. A man Webb had introduced himself at the county assessor's office, said he was a land broker working regional acquisitions. He had been pleasant, Daniel wrote, in that particular way of men who are measuring you while they shake your hand. She thought about Daniel standing outside the assessor's office in Creston on a Tuesday in October, seeing a man he recognized as Webb's associate, understanding that the point was not the man, but the message. She thought about 2 months after that, about the morning Marcus had come to the house before dawn. She closed the journal and set her hands flat on the workbench and looked at the wall. The name Aldous Webb was not known to her, but she knew where to start. Creston was 30 miles east, a full day's ride, and she could not go today because today she needed to think, and she needed to go through the rest of Daniel's papers with what she now knew, and she needed to be very careful about what she did next. What she held in her hands was evidence of something. She was not certain yet of the shape of it, not the full shape, not the edges, but she understood the center of it well enough. Men were manufacturing debts. They were targeting widows on frontier ranches, women who had recently lost husbands and whose knowledge of their own financial records was imperfect, whose access to legal recourse was limited, whose situations made them vulnerable to pressure. They were using forged paperwork and corrupted officials and the general machinery of loss, the confusion, the grief, the desperate need to make decisions in circumstances where clear thinking was nearly impossible, to take land that was not owed to them. And there was a debt in Daniel's ledger, written in handwriting that looked like his, but didn't quite sit the way his handwriting sat, attributed to a creditor called Vance Land and Property Trust, for an amount large enough to threaten the ranch. She went back into the house and found the ledger and looked at that entry again, this time with the journal open beside it on the table. She was not an expert in handwriting. She could not say with certainty that the entry was forged, but she could say that it looked different from the entries around it. Slightly heavier pressure on the pen, slightly more upright letter forms, the ampersand shaped in a way Daniel never shaped his ampersands. And she could say that no corresponding paperwork existed in any of Daniel's records, which was not how Daniel operated. Daniel recorded everything twice. There would have been a contract, a payment schedule, a note signed by both parties. She had found nothing like that. She set both books down and poured herself a glass of water and drank half of it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the south pasture where the fence line ran straight and new from the work Marcus and Pete had done the past 2 days. Then she sat down at the table and made a list of what she knew. Clara Foss, north of Caprock Creek. Ruth Ingram, southeast of Silver Creek. Dorothea Crane, location she needed to determine. These were the 3 women named in Daniel's journal. There were references to possibly 2 others, but Daniel had not been certain about the details, and she had to be careful about what she treated as confirmed. Aldous Webb, land broker. The name Vance, a trust, possibly a man, possibly both. A connection to officials in Creston, which Daniel had described in terms careful enough that she understood he was not certain which officials, but certain enough that there were some. She looked at her list for a while. Then she wrote at the bottom of it, "What do I do with this?" She wrote and crossed out 3 answers before she settled on the one she was going to keep. The first thing she did was find Clara Foss. She knew the general area, north of Caprock Creek, which was 12 miles from the Hart Ranch in the direction away from town. She did not know Clara Foss personally. Daniel had mentioned the name in the journal, but given no indication that he had met her, only that he had heard about her situation from someone at the assessor's office. She might have moved on after losing the ranch. She might not want to be found. She drove out there on a Thursday, leaving Marcus in charge, and telling him she was checking on something and would be back by evening. She did not tell him what she was checking on, and he did not ask, which was one of the things she valued about Marcus. Caprock Creek was a thin strip of cottonwoods along a seasonal waterway that had enough flow in it right now to justify the name. North of it, the land opened up into grassland with a long, shallow rise to the west, the kind of terrain that would support cattle in good years and test them in bad ones. She found the property that matched Daniel's description, a burned-down barn and a house that looked empty, and was preparing to turn around when she saw the woman. She was at the well. Older than Evelyn had expected, maybe 55, with the look of someone who had decided to take up as little space as possible and had gotten very good at it. She was drawing water with the focused efficiency of someone performing a task that did not require thinking. Evelyn pulled up the wagon. "Clara Foss?" The woman looked up. She didn't say yes, and she didn't say no. "My name is Evelyn Hart. My husband was Daniel Hart. He had a ranch south of here near Silver Creek." Something shifted in Clara Foss's face. Not opening, exactly, but a change in the quality of the closed. "I know the name," she said. Her voice was flat with a kind of controlled flatness that Evelyn recognized as the sound of someone who had been angry for a very long time and was managing it carefully. "I found something in my husband's papers," Evelyn said. "Something about you, about what happened to your ranch." Clara looked at her for a long moment. The rope was still in her hands, the bucket resting on the edge of the well. "He died," Clara said. Not a question. "Yes." Clara looked at the bucket. Then she looked back at Evelyn. "You'd better come inside," she said, "if there's anything left to come inside to." The house was not empty, though it looked it from outside. Clara Foss had stayed. The ranch was no longer hers. Evelyn understood from the journal that it had been claimed and that the land itself now technically belonged to whatever entity Vance Land and Property Trust fronted for. But Clara was living in the house anyway, with a stubbornness that was either very brave or very dangerous, or both. "They haven't moved me out yet," Clara said, setting coffee on the table between them with the matter-of-fact air of someone describing the weather. "I think they're waiting to see if I'll go on my own, save them the trouble." "Are you going to?" "No." The coffee was thin but hot, and they sat across from each other at the table, and Evelyn put Daniel's journal down between them and told Clara what was in it. Not all of it. Not the parts about the connection to officials, not yet, because she didn't know how much to trust a woman she had met 20 minutes ago. But enough. The pattern Daniel had found, the forged debts, the widows, the name Vance. Clara listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the journal without touching it. "He came here," Clara said. "A man named Webb. About 6 weeks after Henry died. He had papers." She stopped. "I couldn't read all of it. I've never been... I don't read documents well." He was patient about explaining it. He explained it very patiently. Her voice had that flat quality again. "He told me Henry had borrowed $22,000 from a land trust, and the property was collateral and the debt was due in 30 days. Did Henry borrow money? Henry borrowed $240 from the bank in Creston 12 years ago to buy the first herd. He paid it back in 3 years. He never borrowed anything after that." She looked at Evelyn directly. "Henry kept every receipt he ever had. I have them all in a box. Nothing from Vance, nothing from any trust." "Did you tell Webb that?" "I told him. He was very understanding. He said paperwork could get lost, that he was sure we could work it out, that he just needed to proceed through the proper channels in the meantime." She paused. "He had a deputy with him the second time he came, a man named Greer from the county office." Evelyn thought about Daniel writing. Connection to officials. She had not known which ones. Now she had a name. "I couldn't fight it," Clara said. "I didn't have a lawyer and I couldn't afford one, and by the time I understood what was happening, the 30 days were almost up." She looked out the window at the burned-down barn. "I don't know what happened to the barn. I woke up one morning and it was on fire. Nobody saw anything. The morning light in the kitchen was cold and bright, and outside the window the burned barn stood black against the pale grass." And Evelyn sat with that for a moment and thought about Daniel writing, "Webb knows I've been asking," and about what had happened 2 months after he wrote that. She did not say what she was thinking. She filed it carefully in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept things she was not ready to look at directly. "I need to find Ruth Ingram," she said, "and a woman named Dorothea Crane. Do you know either of them?" Clara looked at her with an expression that was beginning to shift from the flat, controlled anger into something else, something more alert, more present. "I know Ruth," she said slowly. "She's in Silver Creek. She's been working at the hotel since she lost the ranch." She paused. "Why are you looking for them?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that. She thought about the $65 in her coat, and the 6 saddles she had promised, and the ranch she was not going to lose. And she thought about the women who had already lost theirs. And she thought about what Daniel had spent 14 months trying to understand alone, and whether he might have done better with company. "Because I think there's something that can be done," she said. "And I think doing it is going to require more than one of us." Clara Foss looked at her for a long time. The flat, controlled quality was still there, but there was something underneath it now that was moving. "What kind of thing?" she said. "The kind where we take what Daniel found and we make it mean something." Ruth Ingram was at the hotel on a Tuesday, carrying linens up the back stairs, when Evelyn came through the side door Marcus had told her about. She was younger than Evelyn had expected, maybe 32 or 33, with the efficient economy of movement of someone who had learned not to waste anything, time included. She stopped when she saw Evelyn on the stairs. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Evelyn said. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I've just come from talking to Clara Foss." Whatever Ruth had been expecting, it wasn't that. She stood still on the stairs with the linens in her arms and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was trying to stay neutral and not quite managing it. "Clara sent you?" she said. "Clara told me where to find you. I came on my own." Evelyn paused. "Can you take a few minutes?" Ruth looked at the linens, then at the floor above, then back at Evelyn. "I can't lose this job," she said. "I know. I won't take long." They sat in the hotel's back hall on 2 chairs someone had left there, the linens piled on a third, and Evelyn told Ruth what she had told Clara, with more detail this time because she was learning how to tell it. Ruth listened with both hands folded in her lap and her face doing the kind of careful work of someone hearing things they had already half known and finding the other half falling into place. "Webb came to me too," she said when Evelyn finished. "Different name for the trust, Lander Holdings, he called it. But the same setup, the same deputy." She looked at her hands. "I fought it for a while. I wrote letters. I tried to get a hearing at the county office." She stopped. "Deputy Greer told me the hearing had been rescheduled 3 times, and then my water line went." "Your water line?" "Somebody dug it up. In the night. Without water, I couldn't maintain the herd, and without the herd, I couldn't make the payments Webb was demanding as a... He called it a good faith settlement offer." The flatness in her voice was different from Clara's, More recent, less settled. I took what he offered and signed the paper, and I moved here. Evelyn thought about Webb's patience, about how thoroughly and patiently he had explained things to Clara Foss, who had trouble reading documents, about the rescheduled hearings and the dug-up water line and the barn that burned in the night when nobody saw anything. "What did you sign?" she said. "A settlement agreement. He kept the original. I have a copy." Ruth looked up. "I have my copy. Keep it safe." "I've been keeping it safe for 11 months, Ruth said, with a brief, dry expression that was almost a smile and wasn't quite. "I sleep with it under the mattress. The girl who cleans my room thinks I'm strange." "I need Dorothea Crane," Evelyn said. "Do you know where she is?" Ruth thought for a moment. "She went to her daughter's place, east of Creston. I heard she was sick. She might not want to be involved." "I know." Evelyn picked up the journal from her lap. "I'm going to leave that up to her." Ruth looked at the journal. She looked at it the way Clara had, with a kind of recognition that was also something heavier, something that understood that Daniel Hart had spent 14 months compiling it and had not lived to use it. "What are you going to do with all of this?" Ruth said. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said, which was true. She had a direction but not a plan. The plan was going to require understanding how far the corruption reached, which officials, which courts, which channels were safe and which were not, and that was going to take more than she currently had. "But I'm going to do something," she said. "I'm not going to wait." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "I thought about waiting," she said. "For about a week after I signed the paper, I told myself someone else would find out eventually, someone with more authority than me, someone better positioned." She paused. "Nobody came." "No," Evelyn said. "Nobody comes." That. The letter from Webb arrived on a Saturday morning, 11 days after she had found the journal in the workshop. Marcus brought it in from the box at the road gate with his face arranged in its careful, neutral expression, which was his way of signaling that something was not right without alarming her before she had a chance to read it herself. She took it from him at the kitchen door and turned it over. The envelope was good quality. The return address was a law office in Creston. She opened it at the kitchen table. The letter was 3 pages, written in the clean, formal prose of someone practiced at making bad news sound procedural. It identified itself as official notice on behalf of Vance Land and Property Trust, referenced the debt entry in Daniel's ledger by the exact figure she had found there, which meant whoever had written the ledger entry and whoever had sent this letter were connected, and informed her that the debt was due in full within 45 days, failing which the property would be subject to claim under the terms of the original note. There was no copy of the original note included. There was a name at the bottom. Not Webb, a lawyer named Harlan Cole, with an office address in Creston. She read it twice and set it on the table and looked at it. 45 days. She thought about Clara Foss living in a house that was no longer legally hers. She thought about Ruth Ingram with a settlement agreement under her mattress. She thought about Dorothea Crane, sick at her daughter's place east of Creston, who had sold her ranch within 3 weeks of her husband's death at a price her neighbors had described as wrong. She thought about Daniel at the fence line in October, saying a name out loud to nobody. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the pocket of her work apron, and she went to find Marcus. He was at the south barn, working on a harness repair with the focused attention he brought to everything. He looked up when he heard her coming. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. He set down the harness. She told him about the letter. She told him about the journal. She had not told him about the journal before. She had been holding it close, working out what it meant before she said it to anyone. But she told him now because she needed someone to know, because what she was beginning to understand was that doing this alone was not going to work. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, which was his way of taking something seriously. "How much time do we have?" he said. 45 days. Maybe less before they do something to cut that shorter. She thought about burned barns and dug-up water lines. "We need to move before they think we're moving." "The journal," Marcus said. "Is it enough?" "Not by itself. It's Daniel's handwriting in a private book. It documents what he found, but his sources aren't all named and not all of the connections are explicit. We need the records themselves. The original documents from the assessor's office, the signed paperwork from the other women." She paused. "And we need to find out which officials in the county are part of this. Because if we go to the wrong person, we've ended the whole thing before it starts." Marcus looked at the harness in his hands. "Thomas Webb," he said quietly. You know him? Not well, but I know he's done work for the county recorder's office for 6 years, and I've never heard anything against him. Not once. He paused. That's not evidence of anything, I know that. No, she said, but it's a start. She left Marcus to the harness and walked back toward the house along the fence line, following the new post that he and Pete had set last week. And she thought about 45 days and Daniel's journal and the women who had already lost what she was still holding. She was not going to lose the ranch. She was certain of that in the way she was certain of the quality of the saddle she had made. Not with arrogance, not with the blindness of someone who wouldn't acknowledge what could go wrong, but with the grounded conviction of someone who understood what they were working with and was prepared to use it correctly. But she was also beginning to understand that what Daniel had started was larger than the Hart Ranch, and that she had a choice about whether to narrow it back down to just her own problem or to do what Daniel had been trying to do. She stopped at the corner post and looked out at the east pasture. The grass was winter-thin and pale, the kind of pale that wasn't absence but dormancy, something waiting to come back. The sky above it was high and white with cold. She had $65 in her coat and 6 saddles promised, and 45 days, and a dead husband's careful record of 14 months of work he hadn't lived to finish. She could try to find a lawyer and fight the fraudulent debt alone. She could try to make the 45 days run out before anything else happened and hope the next steps were manageable. Or she could do what she had started doing when she drove out to Clara Foss's burned property last Thursday. She stood at the fence post and looked at the pale grass and made her decision. It wasn't dramatic. It felt less like deciding and more like recognizing something she had already decided without knowing it. The way the shape of a saddle sometimes clarified itself in the middle of the night before you had consciously settled it. She was going to take what Daniel had found, and she was going to finish it, all of it. Not just her 40 acres. She turned back toward the house, walking faster now, because 45 days was not very many days, and she had a great deal left to do before she could understand what finishing it was going to require. The journal had one more thing in it she had not focused on enough. She found it on the last page with writing on it, in an entry dated 3 weeks before Daniel died, when the handwriting had taken on its most compressed and urgent quality. He had written, "Records at the Creston Assessor go back 12 years. The original ranch titles, the transfer documents, the lien filings, they're all there in the public record. What Webb's people have been doing is creating parallel paperwork, forged notes, false lien filings, documents that look legitimate to anyone who doesn't compare them side by side with the originals. The problem is that most people don't have access to the originals. The assessor's office files them and most people never go back to look. But the originals are still there. Everything they've forged can be compared to what's actually on record." She read that twice. The originals are still there. Daniel had understood what the answer was. He had been 3 weeks from doing something about it when he died. She closed the journal and set it down on the desk and sat with her hands in her lap for a moment, looking at the lamp. He had known. He had been close. She was not going to let that be where it ended. She picked up a piece of paper and a pen and began writing a letter to Thomas Hart in the Eastern Territories, telling him what she had found and asking him what he knew and asking him to keep the letter somewhere safe. Then she began a second list, not of what she knew, but of what she needed to get. The list was long. The 45 days felt shorter every time she looked at it. She kept writing. The letter from Thomas Hart arrived 9 days after she sent hers. She knew from the speed of it that he had written back the same day her letter reached him, which meant he had not needed time to think about what to say. The information had landed on something he already knew, or suspected, or had been carrying around waiting for a reason to put down. She read it at the kitchen table before Marcus or Pete were up, in the gray early light of a morning that smelled like coming frost. Thomas wrote in a style different from Daniel's, looser, less precise, with the quality of someone dictating to themselves rather than composing. But the content was careful, and the facts were clear. He had heard from Daniel in September, a letter that had struck him at the time as oddly formal, as though Daniel was writing something he expected might be read by more than one person. Daniel had described the situation in general terms. A pattern of fraudulent land claims targeting widows in the western counties, a land broker named Webb, a trust that appeared under different names in different county records. He had asked Thomas to note the information somewhere and hold it. He had not, Thomas wrote, explained why he was being so cautious about it. Thomas had assumed it was Daniel being thorough. After Daniel died, Thomas had not known what to do with the letter. He had kept it. He had not known who to send it to or what it meant without more context. Now he did. He wrote, I have Daniel's letter and I have kept the envelope and the postmark. I don't know if that matters, but I kept it in case. Tell me what you need. She folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edge, the particular pale that came before the actual color of day arrived. Tell me what you need. She needed a great deal. She was beginning to understand the shape of what she needed with the precision of someone who has been adding to a list for 2 weeks and can now see the whole of it clearly enough to know which items are essential and which are secondary. The essential ones were the original land records from the Creston Assessor's Office, which she needed to compare against the fraudulent documents, testimony from Clara and Ruth in a form that could be presented, the identity of the officials in the county structure who were connected to Webb, and some avenue to federal authority that did not run through the county, because the county was where the contamination was. The secondary items were things like time and safety and the absence of burned barns and dug-up water lines. She was less confident about the secondary items. Mtasim. She drove to Silver Creek that Thursday, not to see Marsh. She had no further business with Marsh and intended to keep it that way, but to see Ruth Ingram and to ask Ruth a question that had been forming since the letter arrived. Ruth was on her lunch break, eating alone at the small table behind the hotel kitchen that the staff used when the dining room was busy. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and whatever she read in Evelyn's expression made her set down her fork. Something happened, Ruth said. Something's about to, Evelyn said. She sat down across from her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, including if the answer is no. Ruth nodded slowly. The settlement agreement you signed, the copy you have under your mattress. Evelyn paused. Is there anything in it that would prevent you from testifying about what happened? Any clause that says you waive future claims? Ruth was quiet for a moment. I had a man look at it, a circuit lawyer who came through about 4 months ago. He said there was language that could be read that way. He also said it was probably unenforceable in a federal court because the original transaction was fraudulent. She looked at Evelyn. He said probably. But you'd be willing to try. I've been willing since the day I signed it, Ruth said flatly. I signed it because I had no choice. That's different from agreeing with it. Evelyn nodded. I'm going to Creston next week. I'm going to the assessor's office to pull the original land records, mine, yours, Clara's. I need you and Clara to write down everything you remember about the timeline of what happened. Dates, names, what Webb said, who was present, everything. Greer, Ruth said. Deputy Greer. He was there both times Webb came to me. I know. I need that in writing. Ruth picked up her fork and set it down again. If we do this, if we actually go after it, they're going to know. They'll have people watching. Probably. And then, she stopped. And then we have to be faster than they are, Evelyn said, which is why I need to know now, before I start pulling records, whether you're in. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Evelyn could see her working through it. Not fear alone, not courage alone, but the complicated calculation of someone who had already lost almost everything and was trying to figure out if that made the next risk easier or harder. I'm in, Ruth said. I've been in since you sat down on those stairs. Boy, Dorothea Crane was harder to reach. She was at her daughter's place east of Creston, which was a full day's ride, and when Evelyn wrote to ask if she could visit, the reply came back through the daughter. A terse, cautious note saying that her mother was not well and was not receiving visitors regarding business matters. Evelyn wrote a second letter, shorter than the first, and this one she addressed to Dorothea directly rather than to the daughter's household. She wrote, I found Daniel Hart's journal. He wrote about what happened to you. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't choose to do. I'm asking you to let me come and talk to you for 1 hour. The reply this time came from Dorothea herself, in the handwriting of someone who had not written much recently, slow, deliberate, careful. It said, Come Thursday. She went Thursday. Dorothea Crane was 61 and had the look of someone who had been strong for a long time and was conserving what remained of it with great deliberateness. She received Evelyn in a small sitting room at her daughter's house with the formality of someone who had decided to meet this thing upright rather than lying down, which Evelyn respected immediately and completely. You found Daniel Hart's journal, Dorothea said, before Evelyn had gotten fully settled. Yes, he came to see me. Dorothea folded her hands in her lap. About 10 months ago. He drove out from Silver Creek, and he sat in my kitchen and he asked me questions for about 2 hours. I told him everything. She paused. He was a careful man. He was, Evelyn said. I didn't know what he was going to do with it. I don't know what I thought. That maybe he was going to write to the territorial office, or find a lawyer, or something. She looked out the window, and then I heard he'd died. Yes. I thought that was the end of it, Dorothea said. There was no inflection in her voice that suggested she was offering this as a complaint. It was simply what she had thought, and it had turned out not to be correct. And here they both were. I need to know if Webb came to you personally, Evelyn said, or if it was someone working for him. Webb came himself. Dorothea's jaw tightened slightly. He was very kind. He brought a woman with him the second visit, introduced her as his office assistant. I thought at the time that was unusual, a woman in that role. Later I thought he brought her to make me more comfortable. She paused. He was thorough about making me comfortable. And you signed the deed over. I signed it within 3 weeks of my husband's death. She said it with the particular evenness of someone who had examined this fact from every angle and was past the point of finding new ways to feel about it. I was not well. I was alone. He had someone at the county recorder's office who confirmed the debt was registered. I did not know then that registered and legitimate were not the same thing. I need your written account, Evelyn said. The timeline, the names, what was said. I know you're not well, and I know this is a great deal to ask. Dorothea looked at her steadily. You're going to go public with it? Eventually, yes. But I need to make sure the evidence is solid enough that they can't suppress it or discredit it before it reaches someone who can act on it. Who are you planning to reach? Federal Land Office, Evelyn said. Territorial Marshal's Office. Whatever federal authority has jurisdiction over land fraud. The county is compromised. Daniel established that much. So the county is not where I'm going. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. My written account won't be much on its own. No, but yours and Ruth Ingram's and Clara Foss's together with Daniel's journal, with the original records from the assessor's office showing the discrepancies, that's a different thing. Dorothea looked at her hands. Then she looked at Evelyn with an expression that was old and tired and completely clear. I'll write it, she said. Give me a week. My hands aren't what they were. She paused. And Mrs. Hart, I'm sorry about your husband. Thank you, Evelyn said. He was trying to help you. I thought you should know that. Dorothea nodded once and looked out the window, and they sat quietly together for a moment before Evelyn rose to go. The Creston Assessor's office was on the second floor of the county administration building, a square stone structure that smelled of dust and old paper and the particular institutional dryness of rooms where records were kept and not often opened. Evelyn went on a Monday, alone, having told Marcus she was going to Creston on business and would be back by nightfall. She wore her good blouse again, not for Creston, but for herself, for the same reason she had worn it into Marcia's store. Because what she was doing deserved to be done by someone who looked like they believed in it. The clerk at the assessor's office was a young man named Tilson, who had the helpful, slightly vacant air of someone who had been given a task he understood how to perform and was content to keep performing it indefinitely. She told him she needed to review the original land records for 4 properties and gave him the legal descriptions from Daniel's journal. He disappeared into the back for 20 minutes and came back with 4 folders, each containing the original title documents, transfer records, and any lien filings associated with the respective properties. She sat at the reading table they showed her to and opened the first folder. It was her own property. The original Hart Ranch title, filed 11 years ago when Daniel bought the land. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, the recording clerk's notation in the margin, the signatures in ink that had faded to brown. She had not seen this document since the filing. She looked at it carefully, then took out the copy of the ledger entry, the debt to Vance Land and Property Trust, and compared the signatures. The original title bore Daniel's signature in the precise, slightly formal hand he used for legal documents. The ledger entry bore something that was meant to look like that signature, but had the particular quality of imitation, not wrong enough to be obviously wrong at a glance, but wrong in the way that a reproduction is always slightly wrong when placed next to the original. She was not a documents expert, and she knew it, but she was a woman who had looked at Daniel's handwriting every day for 12 years. She opened Ruth Ingram's folder next, and then Clara Foss's, and then Dorothea Crane's. In each folder, she found what Daniel had described in the last page of his journal. The original records intact, genuine, filed in the normal course of property registration. And in her own comparison against what she had brought, the copies of the fraudulent documents each woman had been shown, she found the same thing in each case. Parallel paperwork. Documents that used the real records as a template but had been generated separately, filed through a different channel, or not filed at all but simply presented as official, relying on the likelihood that no one would compare them to the originals. She worked carefully and slowly, making notes in her own hand, not copying the documents. She did not have the authority to remove them, and she was not going to do anything that would give anyone grounds to challenge what she was doing, but noting the specific discrepancies in each case. Date stamps that didn't match. Notary seals that were present on the fraudulent copies, but absent from anything in the original files. A filing number on Dorothea Crane's fraudulent lien that, when she checked the filing number sequence in the original records, corresponded to a completely different transaction filed 2 years earlier. She was there for 3 hours. Tilson brought her water once without being asked, which she appreciated, and otherwise left her alone. When she finished, she stacked her notes and looked at the table for a moment, at the 4 folders from 4 different lives, and thought about what she had. It was enough, not for a court yet. That would require an expert in document examination and a federal authority willing to push it, but enough to make the case with clarity to someone who understood what they were looking at. Enough to show that the fraud was systematic, deliberate, and traceable. She thanked Tilson and left. On the street outside the administration building, she stood in the thin winter sun for a moment and looked at the street around her. The ordinary movement of a county seat on a Monday, wagons and foot traffic, and the sound of hammering somewhere further along. A normal day in Creston. Nothing about it suggested that 2 floors above the street, a young clerk was sitting with folders that contained, if you knew where to look, the evidence of something that had taken ranches from 3 women and tried to take a 4th. She walked to where she had tied her horse and began the 30-mile ride back to Silver Creek. The second letter from Harlan Cole's law office arrived on the 22nd day after the first. This one was shorter. It informed her that in the absence of any response to the initial notice, proceedings were being initiated, and that a representative of Vance Land and Property Trust would be visiting the property within the following 10 days to assess the collateral. She read it at the kitchen table the same way she had read the first one, with her coffee going cold beside her, and she felt something harden in her chest that was not fear and not anger, but the compound of the two that she still didn't have a better name for. 10 days. She went to find Marcus. He was in the south barn again, and when she came in, he looked at her face and set down what he was doing immediately, which she appreciated more than she said. "They're sending someone in 10 days, she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "To the ranch. To assess the collateral, that's what they're calling it." He looked at the barn wall. She could see him thinking, which was one of the things she valued about Marcus. He thought before he spoke, consistently, even in situations that seemed to demand an immediate response. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to move faster than I planned." She had the notes from Creston in her coat, and Dorothea's written account had arrived 2 days ago, and Ruth had given her a written statement last week. And Clara's was done, and in the cedar box on the wardrobe shelf alongside Daniel's journal and the oilcloth and Thomas's letter. She had what she needed. What she had not yet done was figure out who to take it to. "Federal Land Office," she said, out loud, because saying it helped her think. "Territorial Marshal's Office. I need someone in authority who is not connected to this county." "There's a Federal Land Commissioner's office in the territorial capital," Marcus said. "Takes about 2 days to get there." 2 days there, 2 days back? If I leave Wednesday, I'm back Sunday. That gives us until, she calculated, 3 days before their window closes. She shook her head. That's not enough. If the federal office takes any time to review the material before acting, we lose the window entirely. Then you need someone closer. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Garrett Hale. She looked at him. "I'm not saying he's federal authority," Marcus said, "but he's a large established operator with connections to buyers and officials in at least 3 counties. He might know someone. He might know the right channel. And he already knows you're not a woman who panics." He paused. "He came to you. That means something." She thought about Garrett Hale standing outside Marsh's store with his hat in both hands, looking at the saddle at eye level, asking about 6 more. She thought about the directness of the transaction. No ceremony, no commentary, just a fair price paid without elaboration. "I'll go to the Double H today," she said. She had not been to the Double H before, though she knew the general area south of Caprock Creek. It was a larger operation than she had quite pictured from the name. 2 barns, a bunkhouse, a main house with a covered porch running the full width of the front, fence lines that were straight and well maintained in a way that suggested either a great deal of pride or a great deal of money or both. A hand directed her to the main barn, where Garrett Hale was working on a pulled shoe on one of his horses, with the focused attention of a man who did not hand his animals off automatically just because he had hands who could manage it. He looked up when she came in. He didn't look surprised. She had the impression he was not a man who was often surprised by things. "Mrs. Hart," he said. "I need your help," she said, "and I need to tell you why, so you can decide whether to give it." He set down the hoof pick and straightened and gave her the same attention he had given the saddle, complete, unhurried, actually present. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it this time, because the situation required it, and because she was past the point of being careful about whom she trusted. She told him about the journal and the 4 women and the original records in Creston and the forged debt in Daniel's ledger and the letter from Harlan Cole's office and the 10-day window and the federal channels she hadn't been able to reach in time. He listened without interrupting, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the quality of his listening, the particular stillness of someone who was not waiting for her to finish so he could respond but was actually following every word with real attention, adjusting what he understood as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "My brother-in-law is a federal marshal," he said. "He's based in the territorial capital, but he makes circuit through the western counties twice a year. He was here 4 months ago." He paused. "He's due again in approximately 3 weeks." 3 weeks is too long," Evelyn said. "For him to come here, yes. But I can wire him today. He has authority to initiate proceedings remotely. He can issue an order that would halt any property action pending investigation if the evidence warrants it." He looked at her. "What you're describing warrants it." She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, nothing so clean as relief, but something adjacent to it, something that had the quality of a door opening that she had been pressing against for a long time. "Can you do that today?" she said. "I can do it in the next 2 hours," he said, "if you'll let me read what you have." She took the notes out of her coat. He read them at the workbench, standing, without asking to sit down, with the same unhurried, complete attention he had brought to everything. When he finished, he looked up. "This is solid," he said. "It's not solid enough for court yet," she said. "I know that. No. But it's solid enough for James to issue a hold, and a hold is what you need right now." He set the papers down. "I'll ride to Silver Creek and send the wire. James will have it by tonight." She nodded. She was aware of a slight trembling in her hands that she had not noticed while she was telling him the story, and she pressed them flat against her coat and breathed. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "If Webb's people find out we're moving, if they get any indication that this is going to federal authority, they'll try to suppress the evidence. The documents. They know what's in those assessor files. They know Daniel was collecting information." She paused. "I think they knew while he was doing it." The weight of what she was not quite saying lay between them for a moment. "Then we have to be careful," Garrett said. Not dismissively, as a plain statement of what was required. "Who knows what you've been doing? Marcus, Ruth Ingram, Clara Foss, Dorothea Crane." She paused. "You. That's manageable." He picked up his hat from the workbench. "I'll send the wire today. I'll ask James to confirm receipt and give me a timeline. And Mrs. Hart..." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing something carefully. "While we wait for James to respond, I think you should not be alone at the ranch, not at night." She looked at him. "I'm not suggesting anything dramatic," he said. "I'm suggesting that burned barns and dug-up water lines are real things that have happened to women in exactly your situation, and that Daniel Hart spent 14 months investigating something dangerous, and that whatever happened at the end of those 14 months is not resolved." He held her gaze steadily. "That's all I'm suggesting." She thought about the cold knowledge she had been keeping in the back part of her mind since she read Daniel's journal, the part she had not looked at directly. "Webb knows I've been asking, and what had happened 2 months after Daniel wrote that." "All right," she said. "I have a hand I trust completely," Garrett said. "I'll send him out to the Hart Ranch for the duration. He can help with the work, and nobody has to know why he's there." "I can pay." "You can pay me in saddles," he said, with the brief flat quality of someone closing an argument before it starts. "You have 6 on order. We can work it out later." She almost said something about the terms and then didn't because she understood that he was not trying to put her in his debt, but to solve a problem efficiently, and arguing with efficient problem solving was a waste of both their time. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, the same decisive nod she was beginning to recognize as his version of "you're welcome," and put his hat on and went to saddle his horse for Silver Creek. The reply from the federal marshal came in 36 hours. Garrett brought it out to the ranch himself, which she thought was deliberate, a way of being present when she read it rather than letting her read it alone. She was at the workbench when he came in, beginning the cuts for the second of the 6 saddles, and she put down the swivel knife and wiped her hands on her apron and took the paper he handed her. James Hale, Deputy Marshal of the Territorial West, confirmed that he had reviewed the summary of evidence and was issuing a temporary hold on any property action against the Hart Ranch pending formal investigation. He was also, the letter said, contacting the federal land office in the territorial capital to initiate a parallel inquiry into Vance Land and Property Trust and its affiliated entities. He expected to be in the western counties within 3 weeks, and he requested that all documentation be preserved, and if possible, that the 3 witnesses be available to provide formal statements. She read it twice, then she folded it and held it for a moment. "He's taking it seriously," she said. "James doesn't do things he doesn't take seriously," Garrett said. "It's one of his more inconvenient qualities, depending on the situation." She looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about Clara Foss at the well, pulling water on land that wasn't legally hers anymore. She thought about Ruth Ingram with a settlement agreement under her mattress, and the practical flatness of someone managing anger they had been carrying for 11 months. She thought about Dorothea Crane in the small sitting room, sitting upright. They weren't safe yet. The hold was temporary, and temporary meant it could be challenged, and Webb and Cole and whoever was behind Vance Land and Property Trust had money and connections, and 3 weeks was 3 weeks. Things could still go wrong. But they were further than Daniel had gotten. They were further than any of the women who had lost their ranches had gotten. She set the letter down on the workbench beside the half-cut saddle leather. "I need to tell the others," she said. "Clara and Ruth and Dorothea. They need to know where this stands." "I'll drive you if you want," Garrett said. "I can drive myself," she said. It came out more abruptly than she intended, and she saw something shift briefly in his expression before he covered it. "I mean, I appreciate the offer, but I'd rather go alone. Some of these conversations need to just be between us." He nodded. "No offense taken," his face said, which was itself a small relief. She had been managing other people's feelings about her independence for 4 months, and she was tired of it. "There's something I want to do," she said, "before I go to them, something I've been thinking about." He waited. "When the marshal arrives, when this goes forward, it's going to happen in public. Hearings, proceedings, whatever the process is. And Webb will have lawyers, good ones, and the people involved in the county structure will have resources and standing and credibility." She looked at the letter. "What we have is the truth and Daniel's careful records and 3 women who were wronged." She paused. "I want to make sure the truth gets heard before anyone has a chance to manage it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean specifically?" "It means I want to go into Silver Creek with what I have," she said. "All of it, in public. Before the marshal arrives, not after, because after, Webb will know proceedings have started, and he'll have time to shape the narrative. I want the town to know what happened. I want the people who saw me walk out of Marsh's store 4 months ago, who have been watching me struggle since Daniel died, to know what was done to these women." She looked at Garrett directly. "And I want Webb to know that I'm not waiting for him to make the next move." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking, which was unusual. He was generally readable in the way of people who have stopped trying to manage impressions. "That's a risk," he said. "I know." "If Webb has people in town, if Greer gets word before the marshal has time to act—" "I know," she said again. "But James's hold is on file. It exists. And there's a point where waiting is more dangerous than moving, because waiting gives them time to find out we're coming and do something about it." She thought about Daniel at the fence line saying a name out loud in October. She thought about what had happened 2 months later. They already know something is happening. They sent a second letter. They don't do that unless they're watching. Garrett was still for a moment. Then he said, "When?" "End of the week," she said. "I need 2 days to get Clara and Ruth ready. Dorothea can't travel, but I'll ask her to write something I can read if it comes to that." She paused. "Saturday." Silver Creek is busy on Saturday. He nodded slowly. I'll be there, he said. You don't have to be. I know I don't have to be, he said, with the brief flat quality again. I'll be there. She picked up the swivel knife from the workbench and looked at the half-cut leather for a moment. Then she set it back down. There was more pressing work to do before Saturday, and the saddle was going to have to wait. She went to write to Clara and Ruth. Friday night she did not sleep, but this time it was not grief or suspicion keeping her awake. It was the simple animal alertness of someone who knows tomorrow is the day and cannot make the body behave as though it isn't. She lay in the dark and went through what she had. Daniel's journal, copied in her own hand onto clean paper because the original was too valuable to risk, and she wanted copies in 3 separate locations. Ruth's written statement, Clara's written statement, Dorothea's account, her own notes from the Creston assessor's office. Thomas's letter with the postmark from September, confirming that Daniel had written to him about the situation before his death. She went through the list of what could go wrong, Greer being in town and moving to stop them before they got to the center of it. Webb having already cleared out and left the legal exposure to Cole and the trust structure in a way that made him unreachable. Someone in the crowd being connected to the operation and doing something about it. The documents being challenged, the women's accounts being dismissed, the whole thing unraveling before James arrived. She went through it and she did not flinch from it, and she did not pretend it wasn't real. Then she set it aside and thought about what she was going to say in Silver Creek tomorrow, and how she was going to say it, and what she needed it to accomplish. She was still thinking about it when the first gray of morning appeared at the window. She got up, dressed, and went to the workshop to check that everything was in order. The documents were in the leather satchel, Daniel's satchel, the one from behind the tool rack, which felt right. She checked them once more, then buckled the satchel and set it by the door. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and watched the daylight come. And when it was fully morning, she went to get the wagon ready. Silver Creek on a Saturday morning had a particular rhythm to it that Evelyn had known her whole time in this county. The wagons arriving from the outlying ranches, the noise of the feed store and the hardware and the hotel dining room doing its peak business, the particular social density of a town that spread out during the week and contracted back on weekends into something closer to itself. She drove in from the North Road at 9:30, Clara Foss sitting beside her on the wagon bench, Ruth Ingram in the bed behind them with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and her face doing the controlled, careful work it had been doing since Evelyn picked her up at the hotel's back entrance 40 minutes ago. Garrett Hale had ridden in separately and was already somewhere on the main street. She had seen his horse at the rail near the post office when they came around the corner. She had Daniel's satchel on the seat between her and Clara. "You're sure about this?" Clara said. It was not quite a question. "No," Evelyn said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Clara looked at the street ahead of them. "That's the same thing, mostly." It was not the same thing, but Evelyn understood what she meant and didn't argue with it. She had thought carefully about where to stop the wagon. The center of the main street was too exposed. She needed people to gather, not to scatter. And the far end near the livery was too removed from where the Saturday crowd concentrated. The space in front of the town hall was the right choice, wide enough for a crowd, central enough that people would pass through it naturally, and with the particular civic weight of a building that had witnessed public things before. She pulled up in front of the town hall and set the brake and climbed down. Ruth came down from the wagon bed. Clara climbed down on the other side. The 3 of them stood together on the street for a moment. A widow from north of Caprock Creek, who had been living in a house that wasn't legally hers, a woman who slept with a settlement agreement under her mattress, and Evelyn, and the Saturday crowd moved around them without much attention, the way crowds do before something happens. Evelyn took the satchel off the seat. "Ruth," she said quietly, "if Greer shows up, if any deputy shows up before James's men arrive, you walk to Garrett immediately. You don't argue with anyone, you walk straight to Garrett." "And you?" Ruth said. "I'll be fine," Evelyn said, which she was not entirely certain of, but which she needed to believe in order to proceed. She climbed up onto the wagon bed, which put her about 3 feet above the street level. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but enough to be seen. She had not planned a speech. She had thought about this carefully and had decided that a speech was the wrong register for what she needed to do. What she needed was to say plainly what had happened and let the plainness carry the weight. She raised her voice. "I need a few minutes from this town," she said. "My name is Evelyn Hart. My husband was Daniel Hart, who died 4 months ago. I have something to tell you about what he found before he died, and I'm going to tell it plainly, and then I'm going to show you the evidence and you can look at it yourselves. Crowds on a Saturday morning are not naturally inclined to stop. There's too much to do, too many errands, too much social business being conducted at the margins of practical business. But something in the directness of her voice, the absence of performance, the flat gravity of it, pulled attention in a way that surprised her slightly even as she was doing it. People slowed. People stopped. Men coming out of the feed store paused on the step. Two women who had been talking in front of the post office turned. A small group near the hardware rail drifted closer with the unconscious gravitational pull of people who sense that something real is about to be said. She talked for approximately 15 minutes. She did not exaggerate, and she did not dramatize, and she did not try to manage the crowd's response. She described what Daniel had found in 14 months of careful investigation: the pattern of manufactured debts, the forged liens, the parallel paperwork that looked official to anyone who didn't compare it against the original records at the assessor's office. She named Vance Land and Property Trust. She named Aldous Webb. She named Deputy Greer. She named 3 women. Clara Foss lost her ranch north of Caprock Creek, she said. She is standing here with me right now. She did not gesture. Clara was visible at the edge of the wagon on her own terms, and pointing at her felt wrong. Ruth Ingram lost her ranch southeast of Silver Creek and has been working at the hotel since. She is here too. Dorothea Crane lost her property east of here within 3 weeks of her husband's death and is not well enough to travel, but I have her written account in this satchel. The crowd had thickened. She could see faces she recognized, ranchers who had known Daniel, women she had exchanged words with at the general store. A man she was fairly sure was the hotel owner standing in the doorway of his establishment with his arms folded. She could also see at the back of the crowd and to the left a man in a county deputy's jacket who was not Greer. She knew Greer by description, but who was watching with the particular attention of someone deciding whether to act and what acting would cost him. She kept talking. A federal marshal has issued a temporary hold on any property action against the Hart Ranch pending investigation, she said. That hold was issued based on the evidence I've described. The federal land office in the territorial capital is conducting a parallel inquiry. Deputy Marshal James Hale will be in this county within 3 weeks. The name landed with a weight she felt in the crowd more than heard. James Hale's name was known. Federal marshals' names tended to be. I'm not here to ask this town to do anything, she said. I am here because my husband spent 14 months building this record alone and quietly, and he died before he could use it, and I am not going to let it sit in a workshop behind a tool shelf until someone else buries it. She paused. If you have done business with Aldous Webb or with anyone connected to Vance Land and Property Trust, and if something about that business felt wrong to you at the time, I would ask you to think about whether it might be worth mentioning to the marshal when he arrives. She climbed down from the wagon. The crowd was not quiet. Crowds of that size on a Saturday morning are never quite quiet. But there was a different quality to the noise now, the particular sound of people turning to each other with something to process. She was opening the satchel to show the documents to the people nearest her when she heard the voice. Mrs. Hart. She turned. Aldous Webb was standing 20 feet from her at the edge of the crowd. She had not known what he looked like before this moment. Daniel's journal described him, but only in general terms. A man of medium height and pleasant manner, and she had not found a way to put more detail to it before now. He was approximately 50, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who understood that appearance was a professional instrument, and his face had the same quality she imagined Clifton Marsh's had, a trained pleasantness over something calculating and cold. He did not look angry. That was the first thing she noticed. He looked calm, and that calmness was more frightening than anger would have been, because it suggested he thought he still had options. You're making a serious mistake, he said. His voice was the patient, reasonable voice she had imagined from Daniel's description of the man who had come to Clara Foss's kitchen and explained everything very patiently. The documents you're referring to are legal instruments filed in the appropriate offices. Any questions about their legitimacy can be addressed through the proper channels. This, he made a small gesture that encompassed the crowd, the wagon, her, is not the proper channel. She looked at him for a moment. You're right that there are proper channels, she said. I've used them. The federal marshal's office is one of them. Something shifted in his expression, slight, a small rearrangement of the controlled pleasantness, but she saw it. "I don't think you understand the legal position you're putting yourself in," he said. "Making public accusations of this kind, without established proof." "I have established proof," she said. "It's in this satchel. I've been to the assessor's office in Creston. I have notes comparing your documents against the originals on file. The originals that show no debt, no lien, no record of any transaction with Vance Land and Property Trust or any of its affiliated entities." She held his gaze. "Would you like to look at them here? In front of these people?" Webb looked at her, and she could see him recalculating, rapidly, behind the pleasantness. He was looking for the move that recovered the situation, and she could see from his face that he was not finding it cleanly. "Evelyn." Garrett Hale's voice from somewhere in the crowd to her right. Steady, present, not urgent. She did not look away from Webb. "The proper channels," she said again, "are exactly where this is going. The federal marshal, the land office, and whatever court has jurisdiction over land fraud in this territory. I'm not asking this town to be the court. I'm telling this town what happened." She paused. "Because the women this was done to deserve to have someone say it out loud." Webb held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked at the crowd, really looked at it, the way a man looks at something he's reassessing, and she watched the calculation finish. He turned and walked away. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just away, with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided that staying costs more than leaving. The deputy in the county jacket had already gone. The days between Saturday and the marshal's arrival were the strangest of the entire ordeal. Stranger in some ways than the nights in the workshop after she had found the journal, because at least then she had been in motion. Now the motion had happened, and there was only waiting, which she had never been good at. She went back to the saddle work. The second of the 6 saddles was half cut when Saturday had interrupted her, and she returned to it Monday morning with the focused, narrow attention of someone who needs something uncomplicated to do with their hands. The leather was good, the same quality she had used for the first one, and the work had the usual quality of demanding enough precision that her mind could not run too far in other directions while she was doing it. James Hale arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after the wire, which was faster than 3 weeks, in which Garrett had explained by saying James moved quickly when the evidence supported it, which he had apparently found it did. He came with 2 additional federal deputies and a documents examiner from the territorial capital, a quiet, precise man named Aldrich who wore spectacles and spoke in the clipped manner of someone accustomed to being the most technically knowledgeable person in any given room. Evelyn met them at the ranch. James Hale was not what she had expected, which she supposed was its own kind of information about her expectations. He was younger than Garrett by several years, with none of the weathered quality of his older brother, and instead a particular compact alertness that reminded her, slightly, of a good working dog. Not menacing, but completely attentive to everything in the room at once. He shook her hand and looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who has been given a briefing and is checking it against the original. "My brother spoke well of you," he said. "Your brother has been very helpful," she said. "He tends to be," James said, without particular sentiment. "I need to see everything you have, in order, if possible." She took him to the kitchen table and laid it out in order. Daniel's journal, her copies of the key entries, the notes from the assessor's office, Ruth's statement, Clara's statement, Dorothea's written account, Thomas's letter with the September postmark, the 2 letters from Harlan Cole's law office, and the original ledger with the anomalous entry. James read. Aldrich, the documents examiner, read the ledger entry in the journal and made notes in a small book he produced from his coat pocket. The 2 additional deputies sat in the front room and waited with the particular patience of men who spent a great deal of their professional lives waiting. It took 2 hours. She made coffee twice and did not interrupt except when directly asked, and she answered the questions that were asked of her with the same plainness she had used on the wagon in front of the town hall, because the plainness had worked, and she saw no reason to change what worked. When they finished, James sat back and looked at the table covered in documents. "The ledger entry is forged," Aldrich said without looking up from his notes. "The letter form analysis is consistent with someone copying Hart's handwriting from a sample, not with Hart himself. The pressure pattern is wrong and 3 of the characteristic ligatures are absent." He made another note. "I can put that in a formal report within 48 hours. James nodded. "Cole's office in Creston is connected to the web operation through a holding company registered in the capital 2 years ago," he said. He was looking at his own notes. "We've been pulling threads on Vance Land and Property Trust for 6 weeks from the capital end. Your material closes 3 gaps we couldn't fill from there. He looked up at Evelyn. This is good work. It was my husband's work, she said. Most of it, James said, not all of it. She accepted that without comment. Greer, she said. The deputy. Greer is no longer a deputy, James said. As of Monday. He resigned before we could move on him, which tells me someone in the county structure warned him. We're working on who? He paused. The county sheriff is not implicated at this point. I want to be clear about that. Greer was operating without the sheriff's knowledge, as far as we can determine. There may be others we haven't found yet. And Webb? James looked at her steadily. Webb was in Creston on Monday morning. He is not in Creston now. He paused. We have a warrant. It's a matter of time. She received this without showing what she felt about it, which was a complicated mixture of satisfaction and the awareness that time was uncertain and that men with money and connections sometimes found ways to make time run in their favor. The 3 women, she said, Clara Foss, Ruth Ingram, Dorothea Crane, their properties. That's going to take longer than the criminal proceedings, James said, with the honesty she was beginning to appreciate in him. Property restitution through the courts is not fast, but the fraudulent liens and transfer documents are invalid. Aldrich's examination establishes that, and we'll have supporting analysis from the Capitol. The legal path back to the rightful owners is clear. It's just not immediate. How long? He thought about it. 6 months. Possibly less if the county court cooperates, which they will now that Greer is gone and the federal authority is visible. He paused. Clara Foss's situation is the most straightforward because she never left the property and the fraudulent transfer was never completed with a physical handover. Ruth Ingram signed a settlement agreement, but the circuit lawyer who looked at it was right. An agreement signed under fraudulent duress is not enforceable. Dorothea Crane's case is the most complex because the deed was transferred, but it's still recoverable. Evelyn looked at the table covered in Daniel's papers. 6 months was a long time for Clara Foss living in a house on land that wasn't legally hers. It was a long time for Ruth carrying a settlement agreement under her mattress. But it was not forever. And it was real. The ranch hands on those properties, she said. People who were working for those women and lost their positions when the properties changed hands. Is there any recourse? That's a different proceeding, James said. I won't mislead you. The criminal and property cases are what we can move on. Consequential damages are a civil matter and would require separate action. He looked at her. I know that's not the answer you want. It's an honest answer, she said. I can work with honest. The arrests happened over the following 2 weeks in the methodical, procedural way of federal action. Not dramatic, not sudden, but thorough. Harlan Cole was taken from his office in Creston on a Tuesday morning by 2 federal deputies, with the paperwork served correctly and the whole thing completed before the street in front of his building had finished filling up for the day. 3 associates of the Vance Land and Property Trust's operational structure were identified and served with warrants. A county official in the recorder's office, who had been facilitating the filing of fraudulent liens, was suspended pending investigation and later charged. Webb was found in a river settlement 40 miles west, 11 days after the warrant was issued. He had not gotten as far as he might have, which James attributed to the speed with which the federal machinery had moved once the evidence was in front of it. Evelyn heard about the Webb arrest from Garrett, who had heard it from his brother. She was at the workbench when Garrett came to tell her, working on the 4th saddle, and she set down her tools and listened to him describe it, and then she sat on the stool for a moment and thought about Daniel at the fence line in October. Webb knows I've been asking. She thought about what that knowledge had cost. They'll prosecute him in the territorial court, Garrett said. James says the evidence is strong enough for a federal conviction. Land fraud at this scale, across multiple counties, using forged instruments. It carries significant sentence. She nodded. You don't look relieved, Garrett said. I am relieved, she said. It's just... She stopped. She was not sure she had the right words for what she was trying to say, and she had a general policy against saying things she didn't have the right words for. It doesn't give back what was taken. I know that's not how it works. I know what was possible here was this. The prosecution and the property restitution and the fraud being on record. I know that. She paused. It's still not the same as it not having happened. Garrett looked at her with the same unhurried attention he brought to most things. No, he said simply. It's not. She appreciated that he didn't try to improve on that. She picked up the swivel knife and looked at the leather in front of her for a moment. The fourth saddle was at a good stage. The seat cut was done and the fender work was half complete, and there was something satisfying about looking at it, about the particular evidence of work going forward. "I went to see Clara this week," she said. "She's been told she can stay in the house while the legal process runs. The federal order essentially freezes everything in place until the court settles it." "Good." She didn't say much when I told her. She just— Evelyn paused. She went and sat down at the kitchen table. Just sat there for a while. And then she said, "I knew Henry didn't borrow that money." She said it like she'd been waiting to say it for a long time. She ran her thumb along the edge of the fender leather without pressing. I thought about all the months she sat with that, knowing and not being able to make anyone believe her. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "And Ruth?" he said. "Ruth cried," Evelyn said, which surprised me, because Ruth is not a woman who shows a great deal. But she cried, and then she apologized for crying, and I told her not to. And she said, "I've been so angry for so long that I forgot I was also just sad about it. And I thought—" She stopped again. She thought about what Ruth had said and what it meant. And she thought about the difference between the anger and the grief and how they had been living in the same space for so long, they had become almost indistinguishable, and she recognized that from somewhere close to home. "I understand that," she said. Garrett looked at her. He did not say anything, but there was something in his face that told her he understood what she meant and that it was enough to have said it once. The public hearing in Silver Creek was held 3 weeks after the arrests in the town hall, with the county judge presiding and James Hale and 2 federal representatives present. It was not the full trial that would happen in the territorial court and would take considerably longer, but it was the formal public proceeding in which the fraud was laid out on the official record, the fraudulent documents were entered as evidence, and the temporary federal hold was converted into formal protection pending the court process. Evelyn testified. Ruth testified. Clara was there and gave a brief statement that the judge received with the attentiveness of a man who understood he was hearing something he should hear. Dorothea Crane's written account was read into the record by James, who read it precisely and without commentary, which was the right way to read it. Aldrich, the documents examiner, gave his formal report on the forged ledger entry, which took 40 minutes and was delivered in the clipped technical language of his profession and was completely clear in its conclusion. The entry was not in Daniel Hart's hand. It had been created by someone with access to a sample of his handwriting and significant practice in imitation, but it was not authentic. Evelyn sat in the hard wooden chair and listened to Aldrich describe, in technical terms, the evidence that her husband had not made that debt, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight since the night she first found the entry in the ledger. Not gone. It would never be entirely gone. The knowledge of how close it had come, the understanding of what had been tried, but loosened, made lighter by being said out loud in a room with official witnesses. Clifton Marsh was in the public gallery. She saw him when she came in, sitting near the back with 2 other merchants from the main street, and she noted his presence and did not dwell on it. After the hearing on the steps of the town hall, she was standing with Clara and Ruth and Garrett and 2 or 3 people who had come to say something to her, neighbors, a woman she barely knew who took her hand and said, "My husband thought something was wrong with what happened to Clara, and I'm glad someone did something." When she became aware of Marsh at the edge of the group, he waited until the others had moved off. Then he came closer. "Mrs. Hart," he said. She looked at him. He had the particular expression of a man who needs to say something he would strongly prefer not to say, which she found, all things considered, mildly satisfying. Not deeply satisfying, just mildly. "The saddle," he said. "The one you brought in." He stopped, started again. "I was wrong about what it was worth, and I was unkind in how I said it." He held her gaze, barely. "I wanted to say that." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to say something gracious, and whether she was capable of it right now with everything else still sitting in her chest. "Thank you," she said. She meant it as far as it went, which was not very far, but was something. He nodded, once, and walked away. She watched him go and thought that it was interesting, the things people said when the situation changed around them, the way acknowledgement became possible once the power differential had shifted. She did not trust it. She did not think it meant he had fundamentally become a different person, but she also did not dismiss it entirely because small acknowledgments, imperfect as they were still different from nothing. Ruth appeared at her elbow. Was that Marsh? Yes. Ruth watched him go. What did he want? To apologize, Evelyn said. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Better late than not at all, she said. That's what I decided, Evelyn said. The restitution of Clara Foss's property was completed in the 5th month, which was faster than James had predicted, and which Evelyn attributed partly to the fact that Clara had never physically vacated the premises and had the stubbornness to keep it that way throughout. The judge's order was clear, and the fraudulent transfer was unwound without significant legal contest from the other side, because the other side's legal structure was largely in jail, and the remaining pieces of it were cooperating with the federal investigation in exchange for considerations that James described only in general terms. Ruth Ingram's settlement agreement was voided in the 4th month, the nullification granted on the grounds that it had been signed under fraudulent duress and without full disclosure of the fraudulent nature of the underlying debt. The ranch was returned to her. She did not stop working at the hotel immediately. It took time to get the property back in working order, and she was practical about what needed doing before she could afford to. But she moved back onto the land the week the order came through. She slept in the house the first night with no furniture except a bedroll, and she told Evelyn later that she had not slept that well in 11 months. Dorothea Crane's case ran into the complexity James had predicted. The deed transfer had been executed under the fraudulent conditions, but it had been executed, and the entity that had received it had further complicated the chain of title through a subsequent transaction. It took 7 months. When the order finally came through, Dorothea was well enough to travel, and Evelyn drove out to Creston to tell her in person because she felt it warranted a face-to-face conversation rather than a letter. Dorothea sat with it for a long moment. 7 months, she said. Yes. I'll be 62 in the spring. She looked at her hands. I don't know if I can run it again by myself. It's a young person's work. It doesn't have to be by yourself, Evelyn said carefully. And it doesn't have to look the same as it did, but it's yours. That's what's different. Dorothea looked at her with the clear-eyed steadiness that Evelyn had recognized the first time she sat in this room. You know what I keep thinking about? She said. Henry, he would have... She stopped. She took a breath. He would have been so angry. Not at the loss, not specifically at the loss. He would have been angry that someone thought they could just decide that someone could look at what he built and decide it was just a number they could manipulate. Yes, Evelyn said. Daniel must have been angry too, Dorothea said, to spend 14 months on it. I don't think it was anger, Evelyn said. She had thought about this a great deal, in the nights and in the workshop, and in the long spaces between things. I think he just couldn't let it go. Once he saw the pattern, once he understood what was being done, he couldn't walk past it. That's not really about anger. It's about something that's either going to be addressed or it isn't, and you have to decide which one you're going to be part of. Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. He raised a good woman, she said. Evelyn blinked. He didn't raise me, she said. We married when I was 22. I know that, Dorothea said. I didn't mean it literally. She paused. I meant what 12 years of a good marriage does to a person. The best parts of it stay in you. You can see them. Evelyn sat with that in the small sitting room of her daughter's house, in the winter light of the 7th month since everything had started, and she felt the complicated truth of it, that it was a compliment and a grief simultaneously, that it named something real, that she was not sure she wanted to receive it, and not sure she could decline it. Thank you, she said, which was the same thing she had said to Marsh on the steps of the town hall, but meant something considerably more. The question of what Webb's final sentencing would be was one she watched from a distance, as a spectator rather than a participant. The territorial court proceedings were long and technical and largely beyond the county, and James kept her informed through Garrett in the clean, precise way of someone who understood that she needed to know, but did not need the details of every motion and countermotion. Webb was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud and 2 of document forgery in the 11th month. Cole was convicted separately on similar charges. The county official from the recorder's office received a lighter sentence in exchange for the cooperation that had helped close the investigation. She heard about the Webb conviction from Garrett on a Tuesday afternoon in her workshop, where she was finishing the last of the 6 saddles. He came to the door, and she looked up from the work, and she could tell from his expression before he said anything. Convicted, he said. She put the swivel knife down. All counts, she said. All counts. She sat on the stool and looked at the nearly finished saddle on the stand in front of her. The fender work was done. The seat was done. The hardware was fitted and polished. It needed only the final inspection and the detail work on the back of the cantle, and it would be complete. She thought about Daniel. She thought about 14 months of careful work in whatever spaces he could find for it, at the assessor's office in Creston, in letters to his brother, in the privacy of the journal behind the tool shelf, and she thought about him standing at the fence line in October saying a name out loud to no one. She thought about him knowing and not telling her, and she had gotten to a place with that where she could hold it without it being the main thing she felt. She understood it. She did not entirely forgive it, because forgiveness, in her experience, was not a single act, but a process that didn't have a clean endpoint. But she understood it, and understanding was something. He would have wanted to see it, she said. Yes, Garrett said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the swivel knife and turned back to the saddle. I want to finish this today, she said. Garrett sat down on the second stool, the one that had been there since Daniel built the workshop, the spare stool that nobody used. And he was quiet, and she worked, and the afternoon light moved across the floor in the way it did in late autumn, slow and golden, and already thinking about leaving. She worked on the cantle detail for an hour and a half while he sat there, and neither of them said much, and it was one of the least complicated hours she had spent in a long time. When the saddle was finished, she set down the knife and looked at it and thought it was the best of the 6. Better than the first one even, because she had been refining the pattern as she went, and this one had the particular quality of something that had been thought through completely rather than discovered in the making. The cantle detail was more precise than she had managed before. The seat had the curve she had been reaching for since she was 23 years old, and learning this craft from a man who knew it better than anyone she had ever met. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the skirt. Even, firm, no drag. Done, she said. Garrett looked at it. It's better than the first one, he said. Yes, she said. She covered it with the cloth and looked around the workshop, at the tools in their proper places, at the 2 stools, at the lanterns on their hooks, at the east window where the afternoon light was beginning to thin toward evening. She thought about what came after 6 saddles. She had been thinking about it for weeks, in the spaces between everything else, and it was beginning to take a shape she could almost see clearly. She was going to tell him, not tonight. Tonight she was going to go inside and eat something and sleep properly, for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But soon. She was going to tell him what she had been thinking about, and what she wanted to build, and whether he thought it was possible. But first she needed one good night of sleep. She got up from the stool and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "Thank you for being here when I needed help." "You needed less help than you think," he said. "You're wrong about that," she said, "but thank you anyway." He almost smiled, which on Garrett Hale's face was approximately equivalent to someone else laughing. She put out the lantern, and they walked out of the workshop together into the early evening, the sky above the Hart Ranch going the particular shade of dark blue that came between day and real night, and the stars beginning to appear at the edges of it in the way they did out here, where there was nothing between you and them. The idea had been forming since before the 6th saddle was finished, the way most real ideas form, not in a single moment of clarity, but in the accumulation of smaller observations, until one day you look at what you've been thinking and realize it has become a plan. It started with Ruth. 3 weeks after she moved back onto her ranch, Ruth came to the Hart property on a Saturday afternoon with a problem she presented in her characteristically direct way. She knew how to run cattle, she knew how to manage a working property, but she did not know leather work, and the saddle she was currently using was in poor condition, and the saddle she needed would cost her more than she could spend right now while she was rebuilding. "I can repair it for you," Evelyn said. They were in the workshop, Ruth turning the worn saddle over in her hands with the practical assessment of someone who understands function over form. "I don't want you to repair it for nothing," Ruth said. "I'm not doing it for nothing. I'm doing it because it's a fair trade for something I'm going to ask you." Evelyn looked at her. "Can you stay for an hour? I want to talk through something." Ruth set the saddle down. "I've got nowhere more important to be," she said. What Evelyn described over the next hour was not a fully formed plan. It was more like the outline of one. Rough at the edges, with gaps she hadn't solved yet, and questions she was still working out. But the center of it was clear. She wanted to expand the workshop. Not the building itself, not immediately, but the capacity of it. More hands, more output, more range of work. And she wanted those hands to be women. Specifically, women who had been displaced by what Webb's operation had done, or by the ordinary brutality of frontier widowhood, or by any of the dozen circumstances that left capable women with skill and no platform to use it from. "I don't know how to do leather work," Ruth said. "I know," Evelyn said. "That's what teaching is for." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You'd teach someone from nothing?" "I learned from nothing. Daniel taught me from nothing. I was 22 and I didn't know how to hold a swivel knife correctly, and he was patient with me for about 6 months before I started doing it right." She paused. "I'm probably more patient than he was, honestly." Ruth looked at the worn saddle on the workbench. She looked at the tools on the rack and the half-finished piece of bridal work Evelyn had started that morning, and the quality of the afternoon light coming through the east window. "Clara," she said, "I was going to ask her too. She's got more time than money right now, while the ranch gets back on its feet." "And Dorothea?" "Dorothea has her daughter and a long recovery, and I'm not going to ask her to take on anything else. But I was thinking about writing to her and asking if she wanted to be the first customer." Ruth made the sound that was almost a laugh. "A founding customer." "Something like that." Ruth looked at her steadily. "What are you really trying to build here, Evelyn?" It was the first time Ruth had used her first name, which Evelyn noticed and did not remark on. She thought about the question for a moment, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a practical one. "Something that doesn't disappear when one person dies," she said. "Daniel built something that was entirely in him, in his hands, in his knowledge. And when he died, it was just gone. The ranch, the craft, the 14 months of work he'd done on the investigation. All of it had to be reconstructed by someone else." She looked at the workshop around her. "I don't want to build something that only exists as long as I exist. I want to build something that keeps going." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I'm in," she said. Same words as the first time, on the stairs behind the hotel, but the quality of them was different now. Less defiant, more grounded, the decision made from a different position than desperation. She talked to Garrett about it the following week, on a Tuesday when he came to collect the last 2 of the 6 saddles and stayed for coffee in the way he had begun doing with an ease that neither of them felt the need to comment on. She laid out the fuller version of the plan, what she wanted to build, what she needed, where the gaps were. She was direct about the gaps because being direct about what she didn't know was the only way to figure out whether someone else knew it. Garrett listened in his usual way, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The space," he said. "The workshop is too small for 3 or 4 people working at once." "I know. I need to expand it. That's the first cost." "What's the second cost?" "Materials. Leather at scale is different from leather for one person's work. I need to establish a regular supply arrangement, and I need to negotiate it from a position of volume, not individual purchase." She looked at her coffee. "That's the part I haven't solved yet. I know the craft. I know how to teach it. I don't know the supply side at that scale." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "I buy leather," he said, "for the ranch, harness, tack, general repair materials. I have a standing arrangement with a tannery in Halstead." She looked at him. "If we combine the purchase volume," he said, "the negotiating position is stronger. The tannery gives better rates on bulk orders. We could structure it so Hart Saddle Works, is that what you're calling it?" "I was thinking Hart Saddle Works," she said. "We structure it so Hart Saddle Works gets materials at the same rate the Double H gets them, and we keep a clean accounting of who owes what. No charity in either direction." She looked at him with the direct assessment she was beginning to understand was mutual between them. "You keep saying that," she said. "No charity." "Because it's important," he said. "You're building something. It doesn't need charity. It needs honest business arrangements, and I'm offering you one." She thought about this. She thought about the difference between help offered from a position of pity and help offered from a position of respect for what someone was trying to do, and she recognized clearly which one this was. "All right," she said, "a business arrangement." "One more thing," he said. She waited. "The buyers in Creston and further west that you mentioned in the store when you were arguing with Marsh, the ones whose letters you'd been getting about market rates." He paused. "I have connections to buyers in 4 additional counties. If Hart Saddle Works produces at the volume you're describing, you'll need outlets beyond what you can reach individually. I can make introductions." She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without shifting, in the way she had come to recognize as his particular form of patience, not waiting for her to accept, not pressuring, just present with the offer, and willing to let her take her time with it. "This is going to be a real partnership," she said. "Not me being helped. A real partnership." "That's what I said," he said. "I'm going to need it in writing," she said. "Not because I don't trust you, because I'm building something that has to outlast trust between individuals. It has to be in the structure." He nodded immediately, which told her he had expected that, and found it correct. "I'll have something drawn up." She picked up her coffee. "Then yes," she said. "Let's build something." Boss, Clara came to the workshop for the first time on a Monday in early spring, 2 weeks after Evelyn had converted the attached storage shed into a second workspace. Rough work, functional rather than finished. The kind of structure that said this is a beginning rather than this is the result. She stood in the doorway and looked around. Then she came in and ran one hand along the workbench without touching the tools, the way you touch something you're deciding whether to trust. "I'm not good with fine work," Clara said. "My hands are too stiff in the mornings now. Better by midday." "We'll work in the afternoons," Evelyn said. "To start. What do you want me to make first?" "Nothing yet. First, I'm going to show you how to cut leather correctly, and you're going to practice that until it's right, and then we'll move to the next thing." She paused. "It's slow at the beginning." "I've been sitting in a house by myself for 11 months, Clara said flatly. "Slow is fine." The first lesson took 2 hours and covered nothing more than how to read the grain of the leather and make a straight cut with a head knife without dragging. Clara's hands were stiff, as she had said, but she had the concentration of someone who had learned to do difficult physical things over many years and understood that concentration was what made the difference when the hands weren't quite cooperating. She made 9 cuts in 2 hours, and 3 of them were right. 3 out of 9, Clara said, looking at them without expression. "The first day Daniel taught me I managed 1 out of 12, Evelyn said, "and mine were shorter cuts." Clara looked at her sideways. "Were they really?" "No," Evelyn admitted, "but you're doing fine." Clara made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was the first time Evelyn had heard her make that sound. Ruth came on Wednesdays and Fridays, working around her ranch obligations, and progressed faster than Clara in the cutting work because her hands were younger and more flexible, but slower in the stitching because she had less patience for the pace that good saddle stitching required. Evelyn found this interesting, the way different women brought different natural resistances and aptitudes, the way teaching 2 people simultaneously required her to understand the craft from angles she hadn't examined since she learned it herself. It was harder than she had expected. Not the teaching itself, that was demanding but manageable, but the particular difficulty of watching someone do something incorrectly and finding the right words to correct it without making them feel like they were failing. Daniel had been good at that. He had a way of redirecting without making her feel redirected. She was still learning how to do it. She was still learning a lot of things. The workshop expansion took 3 months and cost more than she had planned, which was true of every construction project she had ever heard of, and which she had told herself to expect, and still found mildly frustrating when the reality arrived. She hired a carpenter from Silver Creek named Bowman, who worked carefully and did not waste materials, and by the time he was done, the workshop had doubled in floor space and had 4 functioning workbenches instead of 2 and a separate area for the heavier cutting work that didn't require the same light conditions as the detail work. On the day the last bench was installed, she stood in the middle of the new space and looked at it. It was not finished. The walls needed sealing against the winter drafts. There were tools she still needed. The lighting in the northwest corner was insufficient for fine work. There was a list of improvements that would take another year to complete. But it was real. It was standing. It smelled of fresh-cut timber and leather oil and possibility, which was a combination she had not smelled before but recognized immediately as the smell of something being built. She thought about what Dorothea had said in the sitting room. The best parts of a good marriage stay in you. You can see them. She thought about Daniel building the original workshop with his own hands on the eastern edge of the property, hammering the frame into the hard ground while she stood in the yard watching. She had thought, at the time, that he was building a place for his work. She understood now that he had been building something that would outlast him, and that he had done it without knowing that was what he was doing, which was the way most things that last get built. She went to her desk and wrote the letter she had been composing in her head for 2 weeks. It went to 5 women she had identified through careful inquiry over the preceding months, 2 in Silver Creek, 1 north toward Caprock Creek, 2 further west in settlements she had heard of through Garrett's supply connections. All of them were in situations similar to what Clara and Ruth and Dorothea had been in: skilled, capable, displaced by loss or circumstance, without a clear path forward. She did not know all of them personally. She was writing cold, which felt awkward, but she wrote the letter the way she had learned to say things in the past year, plainly, without decoration, stating exactly what she was offering and what it would require and letting the recipients decide for themselves. She sealed 5 envelopes and set them on the desk and looked at them. Then she took out one more piece of paper and wrote the letter she had been putting off, the one she had been planning and not quite executing for 3 months. She wrote it to James Hale, not about the criminal proceedings or the restitution cases, but about something he had mentioned in passing at the end of one of their meetings, that in the course of the investigation, his office had identified several additional properties in 2 other counties where the pattern of fraudulent liens suggested Webb's operation had made earlier attempts that were never completed, and that there were women in those counties who had received the initial pressure and then, for reasons unclear, had been left alone when Webb's attention moved elsewhere. She asked James if those women's names were in the public record or could be shared through appropriate channels. She said she wanted to write to them. She did not explain exactly why, because she thought they would understand it when they heard from her. She sealed that envelope too and put it with the others. The first Hart Saddleworks piece sold commercially in the early summer. A bridal set, made by Ruth with Evelyn's corrections on the finishing work, sold to a buyer in Creston through the connection Garrett had arranged. The price was fair, and the buyer asked about future orders, which Ruth received with the flat, controlled expression she used when something mattered more than she wanted to show. "First sale," Evelyn said when Ruth came back from Creston with the money and the buyer's inquiry. "First real one," Ruth said. She set the money on the workbench between them. "How do we divide it?" "Equally," Evelyn said. "Same as we agreed. You did the corrections. The corrections are part of teaching, not part of production. When you don't need the corrections anymore, the sale is entirely yours. That's how it works." She looked at Ruth. "You're almost at that point, by the way. Another month and you won't need me on the finishing." Ruth looked at the money, then at her own hands. "I didn't know I could do this," she said. It came out quiet, not as a revelation, but as a plain statement of something she was still slightly surprised by. "Most people don't know what they can do until they have to find out," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her sideways. "Did you know? Before Daniel taught you?" Evelyn thought about being 22 and holding a swivel knife for the first time, the particular uncertainty of it, the feeling of something in her hands that she didn't yet know how to use. "No," she said. "I just knew I wanted to." Ruth nodded as though this confirmed something she had been thinking. "That's enough, probably," Ruth said. "Usually," Evelyn said. "Usually, it's enough." The mark was Evelyn's idea, and she almost didn't do it. She had been thinking about it since the early days of the expansion, a small identifying detail pressed into every piece that left the workshop. Not a brand in the commercial sense, but something more personal. A private acknowledgement worked into the leather in a place most people wouldn't notice unless they knew to look. She had drawn it out several times and set the drawings aside and picked them up again over the course of months. It was a simple thing, a small compass rose pressed into the leather on the underside of the skirt, in the inside back corner. Not decorative, it wouldn't be visible in normal use, but present. There if you looked for it. A piece of the whole that carried the weight of the whole. She chose a compass rose because of direction, and because of Daniel's journal, and because of the particular quality of knowing where you are trying to go, even when you don't know exactly how to get there. She pressed the first one into the bridal set the day before Ruth took it to Creston, and she did it quickly, without ceremony, because she had learned over the past year that the things that matter most are usually done simply. She pressed the mark into every piece after that. Clara noticed it 3 months in, on a set of saddlebags she was finishing for a local buyer. "What is this?" Clara said, holding the piece up to the light, turning it over. "A mark," Evelyn said. "Hart Saddleworks." Clara looked at it. "Most marks go on the outside." "This one doesn't," Evelyn said. Clara turned it over once more and set it down. She didn't say anything else about it, but Evelyn saw her run her thumb over the mark one more time before she packed the saddlebags for delivery, and that was enough. There was an evening in the late summer, 11 months after she had found the journal in the workshop, when Garrett came for coffee and they sat on the front porch of the Hart house in the particular warmth of a day that was finally cooling, and the conversation moved in the easy, unhurried way that their conversations had begun to move, covering ranch business and workshop business, and the letter she had received from one of the 5 women she had written to in the spring, a woman named Vera, from a settlement west of Silver Creek, who was coming to the workshop the following Monday to see if it was something she wanted to be part of. At some point, the practical conversation ran down, and they sat in the quiet for a while, which was something Evelyn had noticed she could do with Garrett in a way she couldn't do with most people. Be quiet without it becoming something that needed filling. "I've been thinking about Daniel," she said, not because the conversation had led there, but because it was true and she had learned in the past year that saying true things when they came up was generally better than managing them. Garrett waited. "Not the way I was thinking about him at the beginning. It's different now." She looked at the east pasture in the evening light. At the beginning, everything was about him. The grief, the anger about the journal, the work of understanding what he had left behind and what I had to do with it. It was all about him. She paused. "Now I think about him I think about him as someone who started something, not just the investigation, the workshop too. He built it. He taught me the craft. He kept the records that made everything else possible." She stopped. "He started things and I'm finishing them. That feels different from just grieving." "Better?" Garrett said. "Not better," she said. "Different. Grief doesn't really get better, in my experience. It just gets incorporated. It becomes part of the texture of things instead of the whole surface." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said. She looked at him. He had not said this before. She had known, vaguely, from things Marcus had mentioned, but Garrett had never named it directly. "I know," she said quietly. "For the first 2 years, I thought the ranch would just stop," he said. "I kept running it, but I thought of it as running something that had already stopped, that I was maintaining for some reason I couldn't explain." He looked at the pasture. Then 1 year it didn't feel like that anymore. The ranch was just the ranch again, still hers in some way. She's in the fences and the barn layout and about 100 other decisions I still stand by because she was right about them, but not stopped. "You kept going," Evelyn said. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "That's not true," she said. "People stop. People let things fall apart. Having no choice is what you tell yourself, but it's a choice. You kept going because you decided to." He looked at her. "Maybe," he said, with the brief quality of someone accepting a correction they're not entirely sure they agree with. They were quiet again for a while. The sky above the east pasture was doing the blue to dark shift she had watched from the front porch on other evenings, and the first stars were coming in from the east as they always did out here, where there was nothing between the land and the sky except the air. "I want to ask you something," Garrett said, "and I want you to know that the answer doesn't change anything about the business arrangement. That stands regardless." She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture rather than at her, which she recognized as his way of saying something difficult. He had looked at the barn wall when he told her his wife died. He looked at the horizon when things cost him something. "I'd like to spend more time here," he said. "Not as a business partner, in addition to that." He paused. "I don't know exactly what that looks like. I don't think we have to know yet. But I didn't want to keep not saying it." She sat with that for a moment. She was aware of several things at once: the warmth of the evening, the stars arriving over the east pasture, the sound of something moving in the far grass, and the particular quality of the question, which was careful and honest and gave her room to answer in any direction she chose. She thought about what she was building and what she had already built and what she still had ahead of her, and she thought about the difference between being alone and being solitary, which was a distinction she had made somewhere in the middle of the past year and found important. She had become good at solitary. She was not sure she wanted to remain alone. "I'd like that," she said. "I don't know exactly what it looks like either." He looked at her then, directly. "That seems like a reasonable place to start," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does." By the following spring, Hart Saddleworks had 5 working hands, including Clara and Ruth, and had filled orders for buyers in 3 counties. Vera had come on a Monday and stayed, and she had a precision with stitching work that Evelyn recognized as a natural aptitude that would, with time, surpass her own in that area, which she found more satisfying than competitive. A 4th woman named June came from the settlement east of Caprock Creek after one of James Hale's letters resulted in a connection Evelyn would not otherwise have made. June had been one of the women Webb's operation had targeted and then abandoned, and she arrived at the workshop with the careful, watchful quality of someone who has been through something and isn't sure yet if the next thing is safe. It took 2 months before she relaxed enough to work without watching the door. Evelyn did not hurry her. The work itself was the steadiest thing. Whatever else was uncertain, and things were always uncertain, the supply arrangements and the buyer relationships, and the complicated ongoing human work of teaching and managing and maintaining something. The craft itself was steady. Leather was leather. The grain went the same direction. The swivel knife required the same pressure it always had. Good stitching looked the same whether you were making it in grief or in something closer to peace. She thought sometimes about what Marsh had said in the store, what felt now like a very long time ago, a widow's work. She thought about what he had meant by it and what it had meant to her at the time and what it meant now. It meant something different now. Not because she had proven him wrong, she hadn't thought about proving him wrong in months, and she recognized that the absence of that particular preoccupation was its own kind of progress, but because the category had expanded beyond what he had meant by it. A widow's work, as it turned out, was infrastructure, was employment, was the thing that kept Clara Foss's mornings from being empty and gave Ruth Ingram something to do with her hands when the cattle work slowed in winter and gave Vera a place that wanted what she was capable of. Was the evidence, pressed into the underside of every piece that left the workshop, that the work had been done and done correctly and would last. The mark was there. Small, unhurried, in the corner where you had to know to look for it. She had made 43 pieces since the compass rose first went into leather. She knew the exact number, the same way she had counted the nights it took to make the first saddle. Not because she kept a formal tally, but because some things you know without choosing to. 43 pieces, each one carrying the small mark that said, "This came from here. This was made by people who decided to keep going. This will last longer than the circumstances that almost prevented it." She was in the workshop on a Tuesday morning in the second spring when Clara came in early, earlier than usual, before the coffee was finished, and stood in the doorway with the particular expression she used when she had decided to say something. "What?" Evelyn said. "Nothing," Clara said. I drove past the old place yesterday. My place." She paused. "It looked good. The grass is coming back where the barn was. You can barely tell it burned." Evelyn looked at her. "I don't know what I'm trying to say," Clara said. "Just that it looked alive. Still." She came the rest of the way into the workshop and picked up the piece she had been working on the day before. "I thought that was worth saying." "It is," Evelyn said. Clara sat down at her bench and began her morning work in the quiet, steady way she had developed over the months. Her hands warmer now by mid-morning than they'd been at the start, her cuts cleaner, her patience with the detail work grown into something she had started to trust in herself. Evelyn turned back to her own bench. Outside the east window, the spring light was the particular quality of early morning, low and specific, the kind that shows you the texture of things rather than just the surface. It lay across the workbenches and the tools and the leather on the stands and the grain of the new timber walls with an evenness that made everything look simply and plainly like what it was. This was what had been built. Not from nothing. From Daniel's workshop and his journal and his 14 months of careful work and the $65 that Garrett Hale had paid on the street in front of Marsh's store on a Tuesday morning when Evelyn was standing there with her dignity and her saddle and not much else. From Clara's stubbornness and Ruth's anger and Dorothea's upright composure in a small sitting room. From the paperwork in an assessor's office in Creston that no one had bothered to compare against the forgeries because no one had thought to look. From the decision, made in a workshop in the dark, to not take the lower price. That was where it started. Not with courage, not exactly. She had not felt courageous that day in Marsh's store. She had felt insulted and tired and stubborn and not quite ready to give up. Those were the actual materials. Courage was the word people used afterward for the combination of smaller, less dignified things that got you through the moment. She pressed the swivel knife into the leather in front of her and made the first cut of the morning, following the line she had marked the day before, and the leather opened cleanly under the blade, and she thought, yes, that's right, keep going. And she did.